The year 794 marked Emperor Kamu's establishment of Heian-kyo, present-day Kyoto, as Japan's new capital. This relocation from Nara represented more than a geographical shift. It initiated an era that would witness the gradual erosion of centralized imperial authority and the emergence of a warrior-dominated society that would define Japan for the next 7 centuries. The Heian period began with ambitious dreams of Chinese-style bureaucratic governance, yet it concluded with the thunderous clash of mounted warriors at Dan no Ura, where the imperial court's political relevance drowned beneath the waves alongside the Taira clan's ambitions. During the early Heian period, the imperial government maintained the facade of the Ritsuryo system, a Chinese-inspired administrative framework that divided the archipelago into provinces governed by appointed officials. However, the vast distances separating the capital from the remote territories, combined with primitive communication networks, created an administrative nightmare that proved increasingly difficult to manage. Provincial governors, known as kokushi, found themselves isolated from central oversight for months at a time. These officials, initially selected from the court nobility, gradually discovered that effective governance required military capabilities rather than poetic sensibilities or knowledge of Chinese classics. The transformation began subtly in the countryside, where local strongmen emerged to fill the power vacuum left by ineffective imperial administration. These early bushi, literally warrior gentlemen, were often descendants of imperial princes or court nobles who had been granted provincial positions but chose to remain in their assigned territories rather than return to the capital. Unlike their court-bound relatives, who spent their days composing 31-syllable Waka poems and debating the aesthetic merits of seasonal colour combinations, these provincial warriors developed practical skills in horseback riding, archery and swordsmanship. They understood that survival in Japan's rugged terrain required swift horses, sharp blades, and loyal retainers rather than elegant calligraphy or knowledge of Tang dynasty literature. The Fujiwara family's rise to dominance exemplified the court nobility's increasing detachment from practical governance. Through a series of strategic marriages to imperial daughters, the Fujiwara established a regency system that placed them as permanent advisors to child emperors. Fujiwara no Michinaga, who controlled the imperial court from 995 to 1027, epitomized this system's excesses. His daughters married 4 different emperors, while his sons-in-law included 2 crown princes. Michinaga's court focused obsessively on aesthetic refinement, the precise shade of silk appropriate for autumn ceremonies, the correct number of layers in a court lady's kimono, or the subtle differences between various incense blends. This cultural sophistication, immortalized in Murasaki Shikibu's Tale of Genji, created an insular world where courtiers competed in poetry competitions, while provincial warriors settled disputes with arrows and steel. The Fujiwara Regency's military incompetence became glaringly apparent during the early 9 Years' War and the later 3 Years' War in northern Honshu. When the Abe and Kiyawara clans challenged imperial authority in the remote Mutsu and Dewa provinces, the court proved incapable of mounting effective military responses. Instead, they relied entirely on the Minamoto clan, particularly Minamoto no Yoriyoshi and his son Yoshi, to suppress these rebellions. Yoshi, known as Hachiman-taro after the war god Hachiman, demonstrated the emerging warrior ethos through his tactical brilliance and personal courage. During the siege of Kanazawa Stockade, Yoshi famously deduced an enemy ambush by observing the flight patterns of disturbed waterfowl, a level of practical intelligence that court nobles, absorbed in abstract philosophical discussions, could never match. These northern campaigns established crucial precedents for warrior governance. The Minamoto forces operated independently of court supervision, making tactical decisions based on immediate battlefield conditions rather than consulting distant bureaucrats who had never seen combat. They recruited followers through personal loyalty rather than official appointment, creating military bonds that transcended the formal administrative hierarchy. Most significantly, they rewarded their supporters with land grants taken from defeated enemies, establishing a pattern of military conquest followed by territorial redistribution that would become feudalism's foundation. Simultaneously, the Shogun system was fundamentally altering Japan's economic landscape. These private estates began as tax-exempt holdings granted to Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines, but they rapidly expanded to include secular nobles and eventually warrior families. The process typically began when local landowners, seeking to avoid the crushing tax burden imposed by provincial governors, formally donated their property to powerful court nobles or religious institutions while retaining actual control as estate managers. This legal fiction allowed the original owners to continue farming their land while avoiding imperial taxation, since Shogun enjoyed immunity from government interference. The Shogun system's growth accelerated during the 11th and 12th centuries as the imperial government's fiscal crisis deepened. Court nobles, desperate for income sources independent of government stipends, actively encouraged Shogun formation by offering their protection to provincial landowners. Fujiwara no Michinaga personally controlled over 2,500 cho of rice-producing land through various Shuin arrangements, an area equivalent to roughly 6,200 acres. These estates operated as autonomous units with their own administrative systems, private armies, and judicial procedures. Estate managers, often local warriors serving as the noble proprietors' representatives, exercised powers that traditionally belonged to imperial governors, collecting taxes, settling disputes, and maintaining order through force when necessary. The Shogun system's military implications proved as significant as its economic impact. Estate managers required armed retainers to protect valuable agricultural land from bandits, rival claimants, and occasionally imperial tax collectors attempting to assert government authority. These private armies, initially small bands of mounted archers, gradually evolved into sophisticated military organizations capable of challenging imperial forces. The warriors serving Shogun developed intense personal loyalty to their immediate commanders, rather than abstract devotion to distant emperors they would never meet. They fought for tangible rewards, land grants, tax exemptions, and elevated status within the estate hierarchy, rather than imperial ideals that meant little in their daily struggles for survival and prosperity. By the mid-12th century, two warrior clans had emerged as the most powerful military forces in Japan, the Taira and the Minamoto. The Taira, descended from Emperor Kammu, established their power base in the Kanto region before expanding westward toward the capital. Taira no Kiyomori, the clan's most successful leader, demonstrated remarkable political acumen by cultivating relationships with retired emperors and court nobles while maintaining his family's military strength. Unlike earlier warrior leaders who remained in distant provinces, Kiyomori moved to the capital and sought integration with the existing political establishment. He arranged marriages between his daughters and imperial princes, accepted court ranks and titles, and even adopted the refined cultural practices that characterized Heian aristocratic life. The Minamoto clan, also claiming imperial descent through Emperor Seiwa, pursued a different strategy. Based primarily in the eastern provinces, they maintained closer connections to the provincial warrior communities that formed the backbone of their military strength. Minamoto leaders like Yoshie and later Yoritomo emphasized their role as protectors of warrior interests against court interference rather than seeking accommodation with the existing political order. They cultivated an image of martial virtue and personal honour that appealed to provincial fighters who viewed court nobles as effeminate parasites living off warrior labour. The fundamental tension between these competing approaches, integration versus opposition, came to a head during the Hogan Rebellion of 1156. This conflict began as a succession dispute between retired Emperor Sutoku and his brother, the reigning Emperor Go Shirakawa. but it quickly evolved into a proxy war between the Taira and Minamoto clans. The rebellion's outcome demonstrated that military force had become the ultimate arbiter of political disputes in Japan. Court nobles could no longer resolve their conflicts through traditional means, poetic exchanges, bureaucratic maneuvering, or appeals to Chinese precedent when their opponents possessed superior military capabilities. The Hogan Rebellion's aftermath saw Taira no Kiyomori emerge as the dominant figure in imperial politics. He eliminated potential Minamoto rivals, most notably executing Minamoto no Tameyoshi despite the man's advanced age and previous loyal service to the court. This decisive action reflected the new political reality. Mercy was a luxury that successful warrior leaders could not afford when their enemies might regroup and seek revenge. Kiyomori's subsequent rise to the position of Chancellor in 1167 marked the first time a warrior had achieved the highest court rank, symbolizing the military class's ascendancy over traditional court nobility. However, Kiyomori's success contained the seeds of his family's eventual destruction. His efforts to integrate the Taira clan into court society alienated many provincial warriors who viewed such accommodation as betrayal of warrior values. When Kiyomori moved the capital from Kyoto to Fukuhara in 1180, ostensibly to facilitate trade with Song China, he demonstrated the same disregard for traditional precedent that had characterized earlier imperial decisions. More critically, his increasingly autocratic behavior toward retired emperors and court nobles created resentment among potential allies who might have supported Taira rule under different circumstances. The spark that ignited the Genpei War came from Prince Mochihito, son of retired Emperor Go Shirakawa, who issued a call for arms against the Taira in 1180. This proclamation, distributed secretly to warrior families throughout Japan, appealed directly to provincial fighters' sense of honor and their resentment of Taira dominance. Minamoto no Yoritomo, who had survived the earlier purges by living in exile in Izu province, responded to this call by raising his standard at Kamakura. His initial forces consisted of only a few dozen mounted retainers, but his message resonated with warriors throughout the eastern provinces who had grown tired of Taira arrogance and court interference in military affairs. The early stages of the Genpei War revealed the fundamental differences between Taira and Minamoto military strategies. The Taira, based near the capital and accustomed to court politics, initially attempted to suppress the rebellion through conventional means, dispatching imperial armies led by appointed generals who possessed court rank but limited combat experience. Their forces relied heavily on conscripted peasant infantry armed with spears and supervised by a small number of mounted warriors. This approach had worked adequately against earlier provincial rebellions, but it proved inadequate against determined opposition led by experienced military commanders. The Minamoto, by contrast, built their strength through the personal loyalty networks that characterized Eastern warrior society. Yoritomo did not simply issue orders expecting automatic obedience. Instead, he carefully cultivated relationships with local strongmen by offering them concrete benefits in exchange for military service. He confirmed existing land holdings, granted new territories captured from Taira supporters, and most importantly promised that loyal followers would receive permanent recognition of their achievements rather than temporary rewards that might be revoked by future court decisions. This approach created a military coalition based on mutual self-interest rather than abstract political principles. The war's turning point came with the emergence of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's younger half-brother, as a military commander of exceptional ability. Yoshitsune possessed an intuitive understanding of cavalry tactics that allowed him to exploit the mobility advantages inherent in mounted archery. His victory at the Battle of Ichi no Tani in 1184 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of coordinated cavalry charges against static defensive positions. Leading 70 mounted warriors down a steep cliff face that the Taira had considered impassable, Yoshitsune struck the enemy camp at dawn when most defenders were still sleeping. The psychological impact of this surprise attack, combined with the Minamoto forces' superior horsemanship, shattered Taira resistance and forced their retreat toward the inland sea. The Taira clan's final stand at Dan no Ura in 1185 epitomized the transformation that had occurred during the Genpei War. This naval battle, fought in the narrow straits between Honshu and Kyushu, pitted the Taira fleet of approximately 500 vessels against roughly 840 Minamoto ships. The engagement began with traditional archery exchanges between warriors standing on ship decks, but it quickly devolved into close-quarters combat as vessels rammed each other and boarding parties fought with swords and naginata. The tide literally turned against the Taira when the local pilots, initially supporting them, switched sides mid-battle and began providing navigation assistance to Minamoto forces. The death of Emperor Antoku, the 7-year-old child emperor who had become a symbol of Taira legitimacy, marked the end of the Heian period's political order. His grandmother, Taira no Tokiko, reportedly told the boy that they were going to visit the underwater palace of the Dragon King before jumping into the sea while holding him. This act of ritual suicide, known as jigai, reflected the warrior code's emphasis on honor over survival, a stark contrast to the court nobility's traditional preference for exile or monastic retirement when facing political defeat. The sacred mirror, one of the 3 imperial regalia that legitimized imperial rule, disappeared beneath the waves with the child emperor, creating a symbolic rupture with Japan's ancient political traditions. The waves at Dan no Ura had barely settled when Minamoto no Yoritomo faced the monumental task of transforming military victory into lasting political control. Unlike previous warrior leaders who had sought accommodation with existing imperial institutions, Yoritomo recognized that effective governance required a completely new administrative framework designed specifically for warrior rule. The court nobility's centuries-old bureaucratic machinery, with its emphasis on Chinese literary classics and ceremonial protocol, proved utterly inadequate for managing a realm where armed horsemen settled disputes and land tenure depended on military service rather than imperial appointment. Yoritomo's decision to establish his headquarters in Kamakura, a fishing village nestled between forested hills and Sagami Bay, roughly 30 miles southwest of modern Tokyo, reflected his understanding of geography's role in political power. The location offered natural defensive advantages. Steep hills protected the settlement's landward approaches, while the bay provided access to maritime routes connecting the eastern provinces. More importantly, Kamakura's distance from the imperial capital ensured that warrior administrators could develop their own procedures without constant interference from court officials who remained obsessed with precedent and protocol. The contrast between the two centres could not have been starker. While Kyoto's palaces showcased elaborate gardens designed for moon viewing parties and incense competitions, Kamakura's buildings served practical military functions with training grounds for mounted archery and armories filled with weapons and armour. The bakufu, literally meaning tent government, in reference to the field headquarters used during military campaigns, represented a revolutionary departure from previous Japanese governance models. Rather than attempting to reform the existing Ritsuryo system, Yoritomo created parallel institutions that operated independently of imperial bureaucracy. The Mandokoro served as the Bakufu's central administrative office, handling correspondence with provincial warriors and managing the complex logistics of maintaining military forces across vast territories. The Samurai Dokoro functioned as a military police force responsible for maintaining order among the warrior class and investigating crimes that fell under Bakufu jurisdiction. The Monchujo acted as a judicial body that resolved land disputes and other legal matters affecting warrior families, applying practical precedents rather than abstract legal principles derived from Chinese law codes. This institutional innovation created what historians term the dual polity system, two separate governments operating simultaneously within the same territory. The imperial court retained nominal authorities over civilian administration, religious affairs, and cultural matters, while the bakufu controlled military forces, land distribution, and criminal justice. This arrangement allowed Yoritomo to exercise real power without directly challenging imperial legitimacy, thereby avoiding the political instability that had plagued earlier attempts at military rule. Court nobles continued receiving their traditional stipends and participating in seasonal ceremonies, but their influence over practical governance evaporated as provincial warriors looked to Kamakura rather than Kyoto for leadership and legal resolution. The feudal hierarchy that emerged under Yoritomo's direction reflected the military realities that had determined the Genpei War's outcome. At the system's apex stood the shogun himself, bearing the full title of Sei Taishogun, or Barbarian Subduing Great General, an ancient military rank that Yoritomo requested from Emperor Go-Toba in 1192. This appointment provided legal justification for warrior rule while maintaining the fiction of imperial supremacy, since the shogun technically served as the emperor's military deputy rather than an independent sovereign. The title's historical associations with campaigns against the Emishi peoples of northern Honshu emphasized the shogun's role as protector of imperial territory against external threats, a function that would prove prophetic when foreign invasions actually materialized. Below the shogun, the Shugo system established military governors responsible for maintaining order within individual provinces. These officials, typically drawn from warrior families that had demonstrated loyalty during the Genpei War, possessed authority to mobilize local military forces, pursue criminals across provincial boundaries, and guard imperial estates within their jurisdictions. The Shugo differed fundamentally from the old Kikushi governors in their military background and direct accountability to the bakufu rather than imperial bureaucracy. Where previous governors had relied on written reports and administrative procedures, Shugo enforced their authority through mounted retainers who could respond immediately to threats or disturbances. Their headquarters resembled military compounds rather than administrative offices, with stables for war horses, practice ranges for archery training, and barracks for armed followers. The Jito system addressed the crucial question of local land management that had plagued the Shoan estates during the late Heian period. These land stewards, appointed directly by the bakufu, received authority to collect taxes, supervise agricultural production, and maintain order on specific estates or territorial units. Unlike the previous system, where estate managers served absentee court nobles who rarely visited their properties, Jito lived permanently on their assigned lands and possessed intimate knowledge of local conditions. They understood which fields produced the highest rice yields, which peasant families could be relied upon for military service, and which mountain passes required fortification against potential enemies. This practical expertise enabled more efficient agricultural production and tax collection, while ensuring that military obligations could be met when the bakufu required armed service. The relationship between Shugo and Jito created a complex web of mutual obligations that formed feudalism's foundation. Jito owed military service to their provincial Shugo when conflicts arose, providing mounted warriors equipped with horses, weapons, and several days' provisions. In return, Shugo protected Jito holdings from external threats and supported their authority against challenges from local rivals or discontented peasants. Both groups owed ultimate loyalty to the shogun, who could redistribute their holdings based on military performance and political reliability. This hierarchical structure created incentives for competent military service while ensuring that land tenure remained conditional on continued loyalty rather than hereditary right. The system's effectiveness faced its first major test when Kublai Khan's Mongol Empire turned its attention toward Japan following the conquest of Song China in 1279. The Yuan dynasty's naval expeditions represented an unprecedented external threat that required coordination between all levels of the feudal hierarchy. Intelligence reports filtering through Korean and Chinese merchant networks described Mongol military capabilities in terrifying detail. Disciplined cavalry formations that could travel vast distances without rest, siege engines capable of reducing stone fortifications to rubble, and composite bows with effective ranges exceeding anything Japanese archers had encountered. The prospect of facing such opponents forced the Bakufu to mobilize resources on a scale that tested the new governmental system's organizational capacity. The first Mongol invasion fleet departed from Korean ports in November 1274, carrying approximately 15,000 Mongol and Chinese troops, along with 8,000 Korean auxiliaries aboard roughly 300 vessels. The armada's initial target was Tsushima Island, where the local garrison under So Sukekuni faced impossible odds. Contemporary accounts described the defenders' desperate resistance against overwhelming numbers, with Japanese warriors employing traditional individual combat techniques against Mongol formations that fought as coordinated units. The invaders' use of explosive projectiles, ceramic bombs filled with gunpowder and metal fragments, created psychological terror among defenders accustomed to conventional archery duels. After 3 days of fierce fighting, Tsushima's garrison was annihilated, providing the Mongols with their first foothold in Japanese territory. The invasion force next struck Iki Island, where the pattern of heroic but futile resistance repeated itself. The island's military governor, Taira Kagetaka, led approximately 100 mounted warriors against thousands of Mongol troops in a series of cavalry charges that demonstrated both the courage and tactical limitations of traditional Japanese warfare. While individual Japanese warriors possessed superior swordsmanship and archery skills, their emphasis on single combat proved disastrous against enemies who coordinated their movements and concentrated firepower against isolated targets. The Mongols' use of massed crossbow volleys, followed by cavalry charges supported by infantry formations, overwhelmed defenders who expected formal challenges and individual duels rather than systematic battlefield tactics. The main invasion force landed at Hakata Bay on Kyushu's northern coast, where they encountered the first coordinated Japanese resistance. The Kyushu Shugo had mobilized approximately 10,000 warriors from across the island, creating the largest Japanese army assembled since the Genpei War's conclusion. However, these forces lacked experience fighting as a unified army, rather than individual warbands, and their commanders struggled to coordinate movements across the extended beachhead. The initial engagements revealed fundamental differences between Japanese and Mongol military philosophy. Japanese warriors sought personal glory through individual acts of valor, while Mongol units operated as disciplined formations focused on achieving tactical objectives regardless of individual recognition. The Mongols established a fortified beachhead and began advancing inland, employing siege tactics that Japanese defenders had never encountered. Their use of catapults and early firearms created breaches in hastily constructed palisades, while coordinated infantry assaults prevented Japanese cavalry from exploiting their mobility advantages. Contemporary chronicles describe the terrifying sound of Mongol war drums and gongs that coordinated troop movements, creating an alien soundscape that added to the psychological pressure on Japanese defenders. The invaders' practice of taking no prisoners and showing no mercy to captured warriors violated Japanese expectations about honourable warfare, further demoralising resistance efforts. However, the Mongol expedition faced logistical challenges that proved as dangerous as Japanese resistance. The invasion fleet's hasty departure from Korea had prevented adequate preparation for extended operations, leaving the army dependent on supplies that could be landed at Hakata Bay. Autumn storms in the Korea Strait disrupted communication with UN bases, while Japanese naval forces, though inferior in numbers, managed to harass supply convoys using their superior knowledge of local waters. More critically, the Mongol commanders had underestimated the time required to secure their beachhead, expecting rapid conquest rather than prolonged resistance from determined defenders fighting on familiar terrain. On November 19th, 1274, a massive typhoon struck the invasion fleet, while most vessels remained anchored in Hakata Bay. The storm's fury exceeded anything in recorded Japanese meteorological history, with winds estimated at over 100 miles per hour driving mountainous waves against the crowded anchorage. Mongol ships, designed for river warfare and coastal operations rather than open ocean storms, proved catastrophically vulnerable to the typhoon's assault. Contemporary accounts describe vessels being driven ashore like toys, their wooden hulls splintering against rocks while crews struggled helplessly against the storm's overwhelming power. The few ships that managed to escape the bay faced equally dangerous conditions in the open Korea Strait, where many foundered with all hands lost. The typhoon's aftermath revealed the invasion's complete collapse. Thousands of Mongol corpses littered Kyushu's beaches, while the survivors faced Japanese forces that had regrouped during the storm. Without naval support or hope of reinforcement, the remaining invaders surrendered or died fighting hopeless rearguard actions. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. Many interpreted the typhoon as divine intervention by Shinto kami and Buddhist deities protecting Japan from foreign contamination. This religious interpretation would later evolve into the kamikaze concept, literally meaning divine wind, which became central to Japanese national mythology. The 1274 invasion's failure provided valuable lessons that the Bakufu applied to preparing for the anticipated second Mongol assault. Hojo Tokimune, who had assumed leadership of the Bakufu as regent following his father's death, ordered construction of extensive coastal fortifications along Kyushu's northern shores. These defences included a massive stone wall extending over 10 miles along Hakata Bay's coastline, designed to prevent amphibious landings while providing protected positions for archer formations. The wall's construction required mobilizing thousands of workers and vast quantities of stone, demonstrating the Bakufu's ability to coordinate large-scale engineering projects across multiple provinces. Simultaneously, the Bakufu implemented military reforms designed to address the tactical deficiencies revealed during the first invasion. Warrior training emphasized coordinated group tactics rather than individual combat skills, while new weapons and armor were developed to counter Mongol advantages. Japanese armorers began producing lighter, more flexible armor suitable for extended combat, rather than the elaborate ceremonial suits that had characterized earlier periods. Weaponsmiths experimented with longer spears and improved crossbows, attempting to match the range and penetrating power of Mongol projectile weapons. The second Mongol invasion of 1281 represented a far more serious threat than its predecessor. Kublai Khan had learned from the first expedition's failures, assembling two separate fleets that would converge on Kyushu from different directions. The Eastern Route Army, departing from Korean ports, carried approximately 40,000 troops aboard 900 vessels, while the Southern Route Army sailed from southern China with roughly 100,000 soldiers on over 3,500 ships. This massive armada represented one of the largest naval expeditions in medieval history, dwarfing even the later Spanish Armada in terms of troop numbers and logistical complexity. The invasion began in May 1281 when the Eastern Route Army landed on Tsushima and Iki Islands, quickly overwhelming the reinforced garrisons that had been established following the first invasion. However, the Japanese defenders had learned from their previous experience, avoiding pitched battles in favour of guerrilla tactics that exploited their knowledge of local terrain. Rather than meeting the invaders in formal combat, Japanese forces conducted hit-and-run attacks against Mongol supply lines while retreating to prepared positions in the island's mountainous interiors. When the Eastern Route Army reached Kyushu in June 1281, they encountered the formidable stone wall that had been constructed along Hakata Bay, the fortifications' effectiveness exceeded all expectations. Mongol landing craft found themselves trapped in killing zones where Japanese archers could concentrate their fire while remaining protected from return volleys. The wall's strategic positioning forced invaders to land at predetermined points where Japanese forces had prepared elaborate defensive positions, complete with hidden archer nests and cavalry staging areas for counterattacks. The siege of the coastal fortifications continued through these summer months as both armies awaited the Southern Route Army's arrival from China. This delay proved costly for the Mongols, who found themselves committed to maintaining a large army in hostile territory without achieving decisive victory. Japanese forces employed innovative naval tactics, using small, manoeuvrable vessels to conduct night raids against the Mongol fleet anchored in Hakata Bay. These attacks, though individually insignificant, gradually eroded Mongol morale while preventing the establishment of secure supply lines. The southern route. Army's delayed arrival in August 1281 initially appeared to tip the balance decisively in the Mongols' favour. The combined invasion force now numbered over 140,000 troops, larger than any army that would operate in Japan until the 20th century. However, the prolonged campaign had already strained the expedition's logistical capabilities, while the Japanese defenders had used the intervening months to strengthen their positions and coordinate their resistance efforts. On August 15, 1281, another massive typhoon struck the invasion fleet with even greater force than the 1274 storm. The second kamikaze proved far more devastating than its predecessor, destroying an estimated 80% of the Mongol vessels and drowning approximately 100,000 troops. Contemporary Chinese sources describe the storm's unprecedented fury, with waves reportedly reaching heights of 30 feet and winds that could drive fully grown trees through the air like spears. The Mongol fleet, crowded into inadequate anchorages and weakened by months of combat operations, offered no resistance to the typhoon's assault. The invasion's failure had profound consequences for Japan's feudal development that extended far beyond the immediate military victory. The massive mobilization required to repel the Mongols had demonstrated the Bakufu's organizational capabilities while creating unprecedented financial burdens that would strain the system for decades. Unlike traditional internal conflicts where victorious warriors could reward their followers with lands confiscated from defeated enemies, the Mongol Wars produced no territorial gains that could compensate loyal service. This created a crisis of expectations among the warrior class, who had provided military service based on anticipation of material rewards that the Bakufu could not deliver. The Hojo family's role during the invasion significantly enhanced their political position within the Bakufu structure. As hereditary regents who had effectively controlled shogunal authority since the early 13th century, the Hojo had managed the war effort while the nominal shoguns remained ceremonial figureheads. Hojo Tokimune's leadership during both invasions established the family's reputation as protectors of Japanese independence, providing political legitimacy that transcended their origins as Minamoto vassals who had usurped their master's authority through political manipulation. The regent system's evolution reflected broader changes within Japanese feudalism that had begun even before the Mongol threat materialized. Following Minamoto no Yoritomo's death in 1199, his sons Yori and Sanetomo had proven incapable of maintaining effective control over the warrior coalition that their father had assembled. The Minamoto bloodline's weakness created opportunities for ambitious subordinates, particularly Hojo Tokimasa, whose daughter Masako had married Yoritomo and produced the next generation of Minamoto heirs. Through a series of political assassinations and strategic alliances, the Hojo gradually eliminated potential rivals while maintaining the fiction of Minamoto rule through puppet shoguns who possessed the bloodline credentials necessary for political legitimacy. By the time of the Mongol invasions, the Hojo regency had become the Bakufu's true governing authority, controlling policy decisions while allowing ceremonial shoguns to perform the ritual functions associated with their office. This arrangement created complex hierarchy where real power operated through informal channels rather than official titles, a pattern that would characterize Japanese governance for centuries. The Hojo regent consulted with a council of senior vassals when making important decisions, but the family's control over key administrative positions ensured that their preferences ultimately determined Bakufu policy. The post-invasion period witnessed gradual erosion of the Hojo regency's effectiveness. As the financial and political strains of maintaining the feudal system without adequate rewards became increasingly apparent. Warriors who had sacrificed their personal resources to fight the Mongols found themselves impoverished by the experience, while the Bakufu lacked sufficient lands or alternative compensation to address their grievances. This economic crisis coincided with broader social changes that challenged traditional feudal relationships, including the emergence of money economies in urban areas and the development of trade networks that operated independently of warrior control. Religious institutions played an increasingly important role in legitimizing warrior rule, while providing alternative sources of political authority that sometimes conflicted with Bakufu interests. The major Buddhist monasteries had supported the war effort through prayers and financial contributions, but their growing wealth and political influence created potential challenges to secular authority. Zen Buddhism, newly imported from China, appealed particularly to warrior sensibilities with its emphasis on discipline, meditation, and direct spiritual experience, rather than elaborate ceremonial practices. The Hojo regents patronized Zen temples as a means of cultivating cultural sophistication while maintaining control over religious institutions that might otherwise develop independent political agendas. The mounting pressures that had strained the Hojo regency throughout the early 14th century finally reached a breaking point when Emperor Go-Daigo launched his audacious attempt to reclaim direct imperial authority in 1333. Unlike previous imperial challenges to warrior rule, which had typically emerged from court intrigue or succession disputes, Go-Daigo's rebellion represented a comprehensive rejection of the dual polity system that had governed Japan for nearly 150 years. The emperor's vision extended beyond mere restoration of imperial prerogatives. He sought to eliminate the Bakufu entirely and establish a Chinese-style autocratic monarchy where the emperor would exercise direct administrative control over all aspects of governance, from military command to tax collection and judicial proceedings. Go-Daigo's political philosophy drew heavily from Chinese imperial models, particularly the Tang and Song dynasties' centralized bureaucratic systems that had originally inspired Japan's Ritsuryo framework during the Nara period. However, his understanding of these foreign precedents was filtered through centuries of Japanese adaptation and the practical realities of a warrior-dominated society that bore little resemblance to ancient Chinese administrative structures. The emperor envisioned himself as a philosopher-king who would personally oversee governmental affairs while surrounded by scholar officials selected for their literary accomplishments and moral character rather than military prowess or administrative experience. The rebellion's initial success stemmed largely from widespread dissatisfaction with Hojo rule among various segments of Japanese society. Warriors throughout the provinces had grown increasingly resentful of the regency's inability to provide adequate rewards for military service, particularly following the enormous sacrifices demanded during the Mongol invasions. Many provincial families found themselves impoverished by the costs of maintaining military readiness, while receiving no compensation for their loyalty. Simultaneously, court nobles who had been marginalized by warrior rule saw Go-Daigo's movement as an opportunity to reclaim their ancestral political influence and restore the cultural primacy of classical learning over military values. Religious institutions provided crucial support for the imperial cause, motivated by both spiritual and material considerations. Buddhist monasteries had accumulated vast wealth through centuries of land grants and tax exemptions, but they remained vulnerable to Bakufu interference in their internal affairs. The warrior government's periodic attempts to regulate monastic activities and tax temple holdings had created resentment among religious leaders who viewed such measures as violations of sacred autonomy. Go-Daigo skillfully exploited these grievances by promising to restore traditional religious privileges while positioning himself as a defender of Buddhist Dharma against secular contamination. The emperor's most significant early victory came through his alliance with Ashikaga Takauji, a prominent warrior whose family had served the Hojo regency for generations while maintaining ambitions for independent power. Takauji commanded substantial military forces in the Kanto region, where his family's influence extended through complex networks of vassalage and land tenure that had developed over decades of careful political cultivation. His decision to abandon the Hojo cause reflected both personal opportunism and genuine recognition that the regency's authority had become fatally compromised by its inability to address the fundamental contradictions within the feudal system. The Hojo regency's collapse occurred with stunning rapidity once key military supporters began defecting to the imperial cause. Nitta Yoshisada, another powerful eastern warrior, led the decisive assault on Kamakura in July 1333, commanding an army that included many former Bakufu vassals who had concluded that their interests lay with the emerging imperial restoration rather than a discredited military government. The siege of Kamakura lasted only 3 weeks, but the fighting proved exceptionally fierce as Hojo defenders made desperate stands in the narrow valleys and fortified positions that had protected the warrior capital for over a century. The final battle at Kamakura witnessed scenes of extraordinary carnage as Hojo loyalists chose death over surrender in accordance with warrior honor codes that had evolved during the previous century. Hojo Takatoki, the last regent, committed seppuku along with over 800 retainers in a mass suicide that demonstrated both the depth of their loyalty and their recognition that the political order they had served was irretrievably lost. The ritual nature of these deaths, conducted according to precise ceremonial protocols, contrasted sharply with the chaotic urban warfare that raged simultaneously throughout Kamakura's streets as Nitta's forces systematically eliminated remaining resistance. The destruction of Kamakura marked more than the end of a particular government. It represented the complete elimination of the institutional framework that had governed Japan since Minamoto no Yoritomo's victory in the Genpei War. The Bakufu's administrative records were destroyed, its financial reserves were seized by victorious imperial forces, and the complex network of appointments and land grants that had sustained warrior loyalty was dissolved overnight. This institutional collapse created a power vacuum that would prove far more difficult to fill than Go-Daigo and his supporters had anticipated. The Kenmu Restoration began in 1333 with ambitious plans to implement comprehensive governmental reforms that would restore imperial authority while modernizing administrative procedures according to contemporary Chinese models. Go-Daigo established new bureaucratic offices staffed primarily by court nobles and Buddhist monks who possessed classical education but lacked practical experience in military affairs or provincial administration. The emperor personally presided over judicial proceedings, attempting to resolve land disputes and criminal cases through direct imperial intervention, rather than delegating authority to specialized courts or regional officials. These administrative innovations quickly revealed fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of Japanese society after nearly 2 centuries of warrior rule. The imperial government's attempts to reassert direct control over provincial affairs encountered immediate resistance from local strongmen who had grown accustomed to managing their territories without interference from distant bureaucrats. Warriors who had supported the restoration expected to be rewarded with land grants and elevated status, but Go-Daigo's preference for court nobles and religious figures in key positions frustrated these expectations, while creating new sources of political tension. The emperor's land redistribution policies proved particularly problematic, as they attempted to restore ancient patterns of imperial ownership that had been superseded by generations of feudal development. Many estates that Go-Daigo sought to reclaim for imperial control had been divided and subdivided through inheritance, military service grants, and commercial transactions that had created complex webs of overlapping claims and obligations. The imperial government's efforts to untangle these arrangements through administrative decree rather than negotiated settlement generated widespread resentment among affected parties while demonstrating the Restoration's limited understanding of contemporary economic realities. Military affairs presented even greater challenges for the restored imperial government. Go-Daigo attempted to establish a new army based on imperial appointment rather than feudal loyalty, but this approach failed to account for the personal relationships and material incentives that motivated warrior service. Traditional court nobles possessed no military experience and proved incapable of commanding troops in combat situations, while professional warriors remained suspicious of a government that seemed to favour civilian administrators over military expertise. The emperor's attempts to create a centralised military hierarchy modelled on Chinese precedents clashed with Japanese traditions of decentralised warrior bands, led by experienced commanders who had earned their positions through demonstrated competence rather than imperial favour. Financial problems compounded these administrative difficulties as the restored imperial government struggled to fund its ambitious reform program without the established revenue sources that had sustained the Bakufu. The Hojo Regency had developed sophisticated tax collection systems that relied on warrior administrators who understood local conditions and possessed the military power necessary to enforce compliance. Go-Daigo's civilian bureaucrats lacked both the practical knowledge and coercive capabilities required for effective tax collection, resulting in declining revenues that forced the government to reduce expenditures precisely when increased spending was necessary to consolidate imperial authority. Ashikaga Takauji's growing disillusionment with the Kenmu Restoration reflected broader warrior concerns about the direction of imperial policy. As one of the Restoration's key military supporters, Takauji had expected to receive substantial rewards and political influence commensurate with his contributions to Go-Daigo's victory. However, the emperor's preference for court nobles and religious figures in important positions increasingly marginalised warrior interests, while suggesting that the Restoration viewed military leaders as temporary allies rather than permanent partners in governance. Takauji's family had served in high military positions for generations, and their expertise in warfare and provincial administration represented precisely the skills that effective government required. The breaking point came in 1335, when Hojo Tokiyuki, son of the last regent, launched a restoration attempt that briefly recaptured Kamakura before being defeated by Takauji's forces. Go-Daigo's subsequent refusal to grant Takauji permanent authority over the Kanto region, despite his crucial role in suppressing the Hojo revival, demonstrated the emperor's fundamental misunderstanding of warrior expectations and political realities. Takauji had invested substantial personal resources in defending imperial authority, and his followers expected tangible rewards that would compensate their loyalty and sacrifice. The emperor's decision to maintain direct imperial control over the eastern provinces rather than delegating authority to proven military commanders revealed the Restoration's inability to balance idealistic principles with practical governance requirements. Takauji's rebellion against imperial authority in 1336 marked the beginning of a new phase in Japanese political development that would establish warrior rule on a more permanent and sophisticated basis than the previous Bakufu had achieved. Unlike earlier military challenges to imperial authority, which had typically sought accommodation within existing political frameworks, Takauji's movement represented a comprehensive rejection of the Kenmu Restoration's civilian-dominated approach to governance. His supporters included not only disappointed warriors who had expected greater rewards from imperial victory, but also provincial administrators, religious institutions, and even some court nobles who had concluded that effective government required military leadership rather than classical scholarship. The military campaigns that followed Takauji's break with Go-Daigo demonstrated the superior organizational capabilities and tactical expertise that professional warriors possessed compared to the Restoration's improvised forces. Takauji's army employed sophisticated logistics systems developed during generations of feudal warfare, while his commanders understood how to coordinate cavalry movements and archery formations in ways that maximized their effectiveness against less experienced opponents. The imperial forces, despite their numerical advantages and control over traditional symbols of legitimacy, proved incapable of matching the military professionalism that characterized Takauji's coalition. The decisive battle at Minatogawa in 1336 illustrated these tactical disparities with devastating clarity. Kusunoki Masashige, one of Go-Daigo's most capable military commanders, led approximately 700 mounted warriors in a desperate attempt to prevent Takauji's forces from advancing on the capital. Despite his personal courage and tactical skill, Kusunoki faced impossible odds against Takauji's army of over 10,000 experienced fighters who had been reinforced by defectors from the imperial cause. The battle's outcome was determined not by individual heroism, but by systematic military superiority that reflected decades of professional development within the warrior class. Takauji's establishment of a new bakufu in Kyoto represented a fundamental departure from previous patterns of warrior government. Rather than maintaining the geographical separation between military and civilian authority that had characterized the Kamakura system, Takauji positioned his government directly within the imperial capital, where it could exercise immediate control over court activities and ceremonial functions. This proximity allowed the Ashikaga shogunate to integrate military and civilian administrative functions while maintaining closer supervision over potential sources of opposition than had been possible when warrior headquarters remained in distant Kamakura. The institutional innovations that Takauji implemented reflected lessons learned from both the Kamakura Bakufu's successes and the Kenmu Restoration's failures. The new shogunate retained the fundamental principle of warrior rule while developing more sophisticated administrative procedures that could accommodate the complex political realities of 14th century Japan. Takauji appointed family members and trusted vassals to key provincial positions, but he also incorporated experienced bureaucrats and religious figures who possessed the specialized knowledge necessary for effective governance. This pragmatic approach to personnel selection contrasted sharply with both the Hojo Regency's exclusive reliance on warrior administrators and Go-Daigo's preference for classical scholars over practical expertise. The legitimacy crisis that emerged from Takauji's rebellion created the unprecedented situation of two competing imperial courts, claiming authority over the same territory. Go-Daigo's flight to Yoshino in the mountainous Nara region established the Southern Court, which maintained possession of the sacred imperial regalia and could therefore claim legitimacy based on traditional symbols of imperial authority. Meanwhile, Takauji installed Emperor Komyo in Kyoto as the Northern Court's sovereign, providing his government with the ceremonial validation necessary for effective rule, while controlling the practical instruments of political power. The Nambokucho period that began in 1336 represented more than a simple succession dispute between rival claimants to imperial authority. The division reflected fundamental disagreements about the nature of legitimate government in Japan and the proper relationship between military power and imperial tradition. The Southern Court embodied the principle that imperial authority derived from divine mandate and sacred inheritance that could not be transferred through political negotiation or military conquest. The Northern Court, by contrast, represented the pragmatic recognition that effective governance required accommodation between imperial legitimacy and warrior capabilities, even if such arrangements compromised traditional concepts of imperial sovereignty. This constitutional crisis created opportunities for provincial strongmen to enhance their independence by playing the competing courts against each other while pursuing their own territorial ambitions. Local warriors could support whichever court offered the most favourable terms for their particular circumstances, switching allegiances when political conditions changed or when better opportunities emerged elsewhere. The result was a complex pattern of shifting loyalties that defied simple geographical or ideological categorization, as individual families made strategic calculations based on immediate self-interest rather than abstract political principles. The resolution of the Nanboku-Cho conflict in 1392 through Emperor Go-Kameyama's abdication and the reunification of the imperial line under Northern Court auspices mark the beginning of an extraordinary cultural renaissance that would define Japanese civilization for centuries. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun who had orchestrated this political reconciliation, possessed a sophisticated understanding of how cultural patronage could legitimize warrior rule while creating lasting monuments to Ashikaga authority. Unlike his predecessors who had focused primarily on military consolidation and administrative efficiency, Yoshimitsu recognized that true political stability required the cultivation of arts, philosophy, and international prestige that would elevate the shogunate's status beyond mere military dominance. The establishment of the Muromachi Bakufu in Kyoto's Muromachi district created unprecedented opportunities for cultural synthesis between warrior traditions and court refinement. The physical proximity between shogunal headquarters and imperial palaces facilitated daily interaction between military administrators and court nobles, fostering an environment where martial values could be tempered by aesthetic sophistication, while classical learning gained practical application through warrior patronage. This geographic integration contrasted sharply with the Kamakura period's deliberate separation of military and civilian cultures, allowing for cross-fertilization that produced distinctly Japanese innovations in architecture, literature, and religious practice. Zen Buddhism's rapid ascendancy during this period reflected both its philosophical appeal to warrior sensibilities and its practical utility as a diplomatic tool for international relations. The Rinzai school, which had been introduced from China during the late Kamakura period, found particular favour among the Ashikaga shoguns who appreciated its emphasis on direct spiritual experience achieved through rigorous mental discipline rather than elaborate ceremonial observances. The religion's core principles, self-reliance, intuitive understanding, and the rejection of external authorities in favour of personal enlightenment, resonated powerfully with warrior ideals while providing intellectual frameworks that could accommodate both Confucian ethics and indigenous Shinto practices. The construction of major Zen temples under shogunal patronage transformed Kyoto's architectural landscape while establishing institutional centres for cultural development that extended far beyond religious activities. Shokoku-ji, founded by Yoshimitsu in 1382, exemplified the ambitious scope of these projects through its massive compound that included not only worship halls and meditation spaces, but also libraries, art studios, and guest quarters for visiting scholars and diplomats. The temple's main hall, measuring over 200 feet in length and rising to a height of nearly 100 feet, employed architectural techniques that combined traditional Japanese post and beam construction with Chinese innovations in roof design and interior spatial organization. The Golden Pavilion, or Kinkaku-ji, which Yoshimitsu constructed as part of his Kitayama villa complex beginning in 1397, represented the pinnacle of this cultural synthesis through its unprecedented integration of residential, religious and aesthetic functions within a single architectural statement. The three-story structure incorporated distinct stylistic elements on each level. The ground floor followed traditional Shinden Zukuri palace architecture favoured by court nobles. The second story adopted the Buka Zukuri style associated with warrior residences, while the upper level employed purely Zen architectural principles with its meditation hall and golden exterior that reflected seasonal changes in the surrounding landscape. The pavilion's famous gold leaf exterior, applied using techniques developed by master craftsmen working with imported Chinese materials, created visual effects that changed dramatically throughout the day as sunlight struck the building from different angles. Morning light produced subtle golden glows that harmonized with the mist rising from the adjacent pond, while afternoon sun created brilliant reflections that could be seen from considerable distances across Kyoto's northern hills. The building's positioning within carefully designed gardens that incorporated elements from both Chinese and Japanese landscape traditions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how architecture could enhance natural beauty rather than competing with environmental features. Zen influence extended far beyond the temple architecture to transform virtually every aspect of Japanese aesthetic expression during the early Muromachi period. The tea ceremony's development from a simple beverage service into an elaborate ritual art form reflected Zen principles of mindfulness, simplicity, and appreciation for subtle beauty found in everyday activities. Zennoryu's predecessor masters, working under the patronage of wealthy merchants and warrior families, established the fundamental procedures that would govern tea preparation for centuries, while creating philosophical frameworks that elevated practical activities into spiritual exercises. The formalization of tea ceremony protocols during this period involved meticulous attention to every aspect of the ritual experience, from the selection and preparation of utensils to the seasonal appropriateness of decorative elements and the proper comportment of participants. Tea masters developed specialized vocabularies that described precise movements, timing, and aesthetic considerations that distinguished accomplished practitioners from mere dilettantes. The ceremony's emphasis on wabi-sabi aesthetics, finding beauty in imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness, provided philosophical alternatives to the ostentatious display that had characterized earlier aristocratic culture, while creating new standards of refined taste that appealed to both warrior and merchant patrons. The rise of merchant guilds during the early Muromachi period fundamentally transformed Japan's economic landscape through the development of sophisticated commercial networks that operated independently of traditional agricultural production and warrior control. The Zei system, which had emerged during the late Kamakura period as loose associations of craftsmen and traders seeking mutual protection and market advantages, evolved into powerful economic institutions that could negotiate directly with provincial authorities and religious establishments while maintaining their own internal governance structures and quality control standards. Sakai's emergence as Japan's premier commercial centre exemplified the dramatic changes occurring within the merchant class during this period. Located at the mouth of the Yamato River where it emptied into Osaka Bay, Sakai possessed natural advantages for maritime trade while maintaining land connections to Kyoto and the surrounding Kinai region's agricultural resources. The city's merchant families, many of whom had accumulated substantial wealth through generations of careful commercial activity, began investing in manufacturing enterprises that produced goods specifically for export markets rather than local consumption. The city's sword-making industry achieved international recognition for producing blades that combined traditional Japanese metallurgical techniques with innovations learned through contact with Chinese and Korean craftsmen. Sakai swordsmiths developed new forging methods that created steel with superior flexibility and edge retention compared to conventional Japanese weapons, while their polishing techniques produced mirror-like finishes that enhanced both the aesthetic appeal and practical performance of finished blades. These weapons commanded premium prices in overseas markets, particularly in China where Japanese swords were prized by military officers and wealthy collectors who appreciated their superior craftsmanship. The textile industry in Sakai and other commercial centres began producing luxury fabrics that competed successfully with Chinese imports through innovations in dyeing techniques and pattern design. Japanese weavers developed new methods for creating complex geometric patterns using multiple coloured threads, while dyers experimented with plant-based pigments that produce colours unavailable through conventional techniques. The resulting fabrics appealed to both domestic and foreign markets, with Chinese merchants paying substantial premiums for Japanese textiles that displayed distinctive aesthetic qualities not found in their own products. Diplomatic relations with Ming China reached unprecedented levels of sophistication during Yoshimitsu's reign through the implementation of the tally trade system that provided formal frameworks for commercial and cultural exchange between the two nations. The Kango-Boeki arrangements, negotiated through complex diplomatic protocols that required careful attention to ceremonial precedent and mutual face-saving, established Japan as a tributary state within the Chinese world order, while preserving practical independence in domestic affairs. This relationship provided substantial economic benefits through access to Chinese markets and luxury goods, while creating opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched Japanese civilization without compromising its distinctive characteristics. The tally system's operation required elaborate administrative procedures that demonstrated both governments' commitment to maintaining peaceful relations, despite periodic tensions over trade volumes and diplomatic protocol. Chinese authorities issued numbered tallies to authorize Japanese merchants that served as passports and trade licenses, while Japanese officials maintained careful records of all transactions to ensure compliance with agreed-upon limitations on export quantities and product categories. These arrangements protected Chinese domestic industries from excessive competition, while providing Japanese merchants with guaranteed market access that justified the substantial investments required for overseas trade. Japanese diplomatic missions to the Ming capital at Nanjing became elaborate cultural exhibitions that showcased Japanese artistic achievements while gathering intelligence about Chinese political developments and technological innovations. These embassies included not only government officials and merchants, but also artists, scholars, and craftsmen who could demonstrate Japanese capabilities while learning from their Chinese counterparts. The exchange of gifts between the two courts involved precious objects that represented the highest levels of artistic achievement in both cultures, creating competitive pressures that stimulated innovation and quality improvement in luxury crafts. The cultural impact of these diplomatic exchanges extended far beyond immediate commercial benefits to influence Japanese artistic development in fundamental ways. Chinese painting techniques, particularly those associated with Zen Buddhist art, were adapted by Japanese artists who combined them with indigenous aesthetic traditions to create distinctively Japanese styles that would influence East Asian art for centuries. The importation of Chinese books and scholarly works provided Japanese intellectuals with access to contemporary developments in philosophy, literature, and scientific knowledge, while stimulating domestic scholarship that built upon foreign learning to address specifically Japanese concerns. Zen monastery schools emerged as crucial institutions for transmitting this imported knowledge while developing distinctively Japanese approaches to education and scholarship. These institutions attracted students from warrior families who sought cultural refinement as well as religious instruction, creating educational environments that combined practical training in military arts with sophisticated study of literature, philosophy, and artistic techniques. The monastery's libraries accumulated vast collections of Chinese texts while producing original Japanese works that demonstrated mastery of foreign learning and its creative adaptation to domestic circumstances. The development of Japanese ink painting during this period exemplified the successful synthesis of foreign techniques with indigenous aesthetic sensibilities that characterized Muromachi cultural achievements. Artists like Sesshu, who studied in China during the 1460s, mastered Chinese landscape painting methods while developing distinctively Japanese approaches to composition and subject matter that reflected the archipelago's unique geographical features and cultural traditions. Their works demonstrated technical competence comparable to the finest Chinese models, while expressing aesthetic values that remained fundamentally Japanese in their appreciation for seasonal change, natural impermanence, and the subtle beauty found in everyday rural scenes. The patronage system that supported these artistic developments created complex relationships between creators and sponsors that influenced both the content and style of cultural production. Wealthy merchants, seeking to enhance their social status through association with refined culture, commissioned works that demonstrated their sophisticated taste, while providing artists with the financial security necessary for experimental innovation. Warrior families, eager to legitimize their political authority through cultural achievement, supported projects that showcased their commitment to civilization while creating lasting monuments to their patronage. The emergence of professional artistic guilds paralleled developments in commercial and craft organizations, establishing quality standards and training procedures that ensured consistent excellence while protecting established practitioners from unqualified competition. These guilds developed elaborate apprenticeship systems that required years of study under recognized masters, creating educational frameworks that preserved traditional techniques while encouraging innovation within established parameters. The guild system's emphasis on collective responsibility for maintaining artistic standards created peer pressure for excellence that elevated the overall quality of Japanese cultural production. The cultural flowering that had characterized the early Muromachi period came to an abrupt and violent end when rival factions within the Ashikaga shogunate finally abandoned diplomatic maneuvering in favor of armed conflict during the spring of 1467. The Onin War, which would devastate Kyoto for the next decade, began ostensibly as a succession dispute over who would inherit the position of 8th Ashikaga shogun, but it quickly evolved into a comprehensive breakdown of the political arrangements that had maintained relative stability for nearly 3/4 of a century. The conflict's immediate trigger involved the rivalry between Hosokawa Katsumoto and Yamana Sozen, two of the most powerful Shugo daimyo whose accumulated grievances and territorial ambitions had reached irreconcilable levels by the mid-1460s. Hosokawa Katsumoto commanded the Eastern Army, which initially supported Ashikaga Yoshimi's claim to succeed his brother Yoshimasa as shogun, while Yamana Sozen led the Western Army backing the infant Yoshihisa, son of Yoshimasa and his wife Hino Tomiko. However, these nominal succession issues masked deeper structural problems within the shogunal system that had been developing since the early 15th century. The Shugo daimyo had gradually accumulated territorial holdings and military resources that rivaled or exceeded the shogun's own power base, creating a situation where provincial governors possessed the capability to challenge central authority whenever their interests conflicted with shogunal policies. The delicate balance that had previously maintained order depended on the shogun's ability to mediate between competing factions while preventing any single daimyo from accumulating overwhelming advantages. But Yoshimasa's political weakness and personal indifference to governance had allowed these tensions to escalate beyond peaceful resolution. The war's opening phases demonstrated how completely the traditional mechanisms of conflict resolution had broken down within Japanese political society. Previous disputes between major daimyo families had typically been resolved through shogunal mediation, marriage alliances, or territorial adjustments that addressed underlying grievances without requiring extensive military action. The elaborate diplomatic protocols that had governed relations between warrior families for generations proved utterly inadequate when both sides possessed comparable military strength, and neither was willing to accept compromise solutions that might appear to diminish their status or territorial control. The result was armed conflict on a scale that Japan had not experienced since the Genpei War, nearly 3 centuries earlier. The fighting that erupted in Kyoto during the summer of 1467 transformed Japan's ancient capital into a battlefield, where heavily armoured cavalry charged through streets that had previously witnessed only ceremonial processions and religious festivals. The Eastern Army established fortified positions in the northeastern sections of the city, constructing elaborate earthworks and palisades that turned residential districts into military compounds, defended by thousands of Ashigaru foot soldiers armed with spears, crossbows, and the earliest firearms that had begun appearing in Japanese arsenals. The Western Army responded by fortifying the southwestern quarters, creating a defensive network that included not only military installations, but also commandeered temples, palaces, and merchant establishments that were converted into supply depots and barracks for the estimated 80,000 warriors who eventually participated in the siege. The urban warfare that characterized the Onin conflict introduced tactical innovations that would profoundly influence Japanese military development for the remainder of the medieval period. Traditional cavalry charges proved largely ineffective in the narrow streets and confined spaces of the capital, forcing commanders to rely increasingly on disciplined infantry formations that could maintain cohesion while advancing through debris-filled thoroughfares and defending fixed positions against repeated assaults. The extensive use of fire arrows and incendiary devices created massive conflagrations that destroyed entire neighbourhoods, including many of the architectural masterpieces that had been constructed during the previous century of cultural achievement. The Golden Pavilion survived only because of its isolated location outside the main combat zones, but countless temples, palaces, and private residences were reduced to ash during the decade of fighting. The war's duration exceeded all contemporary expectations, as neither side possessed the decisive military advantages necessary to achieve rapid victory over their opponents. The Eastern and Western armies maintained roughly equal strength throughout most of the conflict, with periodic reinforcements from provincial allies balancing losses suffered during the continuous skirmishing that characterized daily life in the besieged capital. The absence of clear strategic objectives beyond the elimination of rival factions meant that military operations focused on attrition rather than territorial conquest, creating a grinding war of endurance that gradually exhausted both sides' resources while producing minimal tactical gains for either faction. Supply problems became increasingly critical as the war dragged on through multiple campaign seasons, forcing both armies to implement increasingly desperate measures to maintain their forces in the field. The surrounding countryside, which had traditionally provided agricultural products for Kyoto's population, was systematically devastated by foraging parties that seized crops, livestock, and stored provisions without regard for the survival of rural communities. Peasant families fled their villages in massive numbers, seeking refuge in mountain monasteries or distant provinces where they might escape the constant requisitions and military service obligations that made normal agricultural activities impossible. The resulting food shortages affected not only the competing armies, but also the civilian population that remained trapped within the capital, creating humanitarian crises that further complicated military planning and resource allocation. The conflict's resolution in 1477 came not through decisive military victory, but through mutual exhaustion that left both factions incapable of continuing effective operations. Hosokawa Katsumoto's death in 1473 had already weakened the Eastern Army's leadership, while Yamana Sozen's demise the following year similarly disrupted Western Army coordination. Their successors lacked both the personal authority and financial resources necessary to maintain the large-scale military operations that the war had required, forcing gradual withdrawals that left Kyoto devastated, but technically under shogunal control. However, this nominal victory meant little in practical terms, as the Ashikaga shogunate emerged from the conflict with its authority permanently compromised and its ability to control provincial affairs effectively destroyed. The war's aftermath revealed the complete collapse of the centralized feudal system that had governed Japan since the Kamakura period's establishment in the late 12th century. Provincial shugo, who had committed substantial resources to supporting either faction, found themselves financially ruined and politically isolated, creating power vacuums that were quickly filled by local strongmen who possessed the military capability and administrative experience necessary for effective regional governance. These emerging Sengoku daimyo differed fundamentally from their Shugo predecessors in their approach to territorial control and political legitimacy, abandoning the fiction of shogunal appointment in favour of direct military conquest and practical administrative competence. The transformation from Shugo to Sengoku daimyo represented more than a simple change in titles or administrative procedures. It marked the emergence of genuinely independent territorial states that operated according to their own laws, maintained their own military forces, and pursued their own diplomatic policies without reference to central authority. Unlike the previous system where provincial governors had served as intermediaries between the shogun and local warrior communities, the new daimyo ruled their domains as autonomous sovereigns who acknowledged no superior authority beyond their own military capabilities and administrative effectiveness. This fundamental shift in political organization created the conditions for the century of warfare that would define the Sengoku period. Oda Nobunaga's rise to prominence in Owari province during the 1550s exemplified the new type of leadership that emerged from the Onin War's destruction of traditional political arrangements. Born into a relatively minor branch of the Oda family, Nobunaga inherited control over only a small portion of Owari when his father died in 1551, but his innovative military tactics and ruthless political methods enabled him to consolidate control over the entire province within a decade. His success stemmed from his willingness to abandon conventional warrior practices in favour of whatever methods proved most effective, regardless of their compatibility with traditional concepts of honour or legitimate authority. Nobunaga's military innovations began with his systematic recruitment and training of Ashigaru infantry units that were equipped with the latest firearms and organised according to principles derived from contemporary European military manuals. The introduction of Portuguese matchlocks to Japan in 1543 had initially been treated as a curiosity by most daimyo, who continued to rely primarily on traditional weapons and tactics that emphasized individual skill and personal courage over coordinated group operations. Nobunaga recognized that firearms could provide decisive advantages when employed by disciplined formations that could deliver concentrated volleys against enemy cavalry or infantry, but effective use required extensive training and standardized equipment that most warrior leaders were unwilling to provide. The Battle of Nagakute in 1584 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of properly coordinated firearm units when employed against traditional cavalry formations. Nobunaga's Ashigaru, arranged in 3 ranks with rotating firing sequences that maintained continuous pressure on advancing enemies, decimated mounted samurai who had expected to overwhelm foot soldiers through conventional cavalry charges. The psychological impact of massed gunfire proved as significant as its physical effects, as horses trained for traditional battlefield conditions panicked when exposed to the unfamiliar sounds and smoke that characterized firearm combat. The result was a tactical revolution that forced all subsequent military leaders to reconsider their approach to battlefield organization and equipment procurement. The strategic implications of these tactical changes extended far beyond immediate military applications to influence the entire structure of daimyo governance and territorial administration. Maintaining effective firearm units required substantial financial resources for purchasing weapons, ammunition, and training equipment, while the specialized skills necessary for gunpowder production and weapon maintenance demanded technical expertise that few traditional warrior families possessed. Successful daimyo were forced to cultivate relationships with merchant communities that could provide both the capital and technical knowledge necessary for military modernization, creating new forms of cooperation between warrior and commercial classes that had previously maintained distinct social boundaries. Castle construction techniques underwent equally dramatic transformations during this period, as military engineers developed new fortification designs capable of withstanding both traditional siege methods and the emerging threat posed by artillery weapons. The hilltop fortresses that had characterized earlier defensive architecture proved vulnerable to cannon fire that could breach stone walls and wooden palisades with relative ease, forcing architects to develop more sophisticated approaches to defensive planning that incorporated multiple defensive lines, concealed firing positions, and elaborate systems of interlocking fields of fire that maximized defensive advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy bombardment. Azuchi Castle, which Nobunaga began constructing in 1576 on the shores of Lake Biwa, represented the pinnacle of these architectural innovations through its unprecedented combination of defensive effectiveness and symbolic grandeur. The massive stone foundation, rising over 100 feet above the surrounding terrain, employed advanced masonry techniques that created walls capable of withstanding direct artillery bombardment while providing stable platforms for the castle's own defensive weapons. The complex arrangement of courtyards, gates, and defensive positions forced attacking armies to advance through predetermined killing zones where defenders could concentrate their fire while remaining protected from return volleys. The castle's residential quarters, located in the uppermost sections of the complex, demonstrated how military architecture could simultaneously serve defensive and ceremonial functions through careful attention to both practical security requirements and aesthetic considerations. The main keep, rising 7 stories above its stone foundation, employed architectural techniques borrowed from both traditional Japanese palace construction and contemporary European fortress design, creating interior spaces that could accommodate both military planning sessions and elaborate entertainment events designed to impress visiting dignitaries and potential allies. The proliferation of similar castle construction projects throughout Japan during the late 16th century reflected the increasing resources that successful daimyo could devote to both military and ceremonial purposes as their territorial control expanded and their administrative systems became more sophisticated. These massive building projects required coordination between multiple specialized crafts, stonemasons, carpenters, metal workers and artists, while demanding logistical capabilities that could transport enormous quantities of materials across considerable distances. The successful completion of such undertakings demonstrated a daimyo's organizational competence while creating permanent symbols of their authority that could be seen from great distances across their domains. The economic foundations that supported these military and architectural innovations depended on agricultural improvements and commercial developments that generated unprecedented levels of surplus wealth for investment in military modernization. The introduction of new rice varieties from China and Korea, combined with improved irrigation techniques and more intensive cultivation methods, increased agricultural productivity sufficiently to support larger non-agricultural populations, while providing the tax revenues necessary for maintaining professional military forces. Successful daimyo implemented land surveys that precisely documented agricultural productivity within their territories, enabling more efficient tax collection while providing the detailed economic information necessary for long-term planning and resource allocation. Commercial activities expanded dramatically during this period as regional trade networks developed to support the movement of military supplies, luxury goods, and technical specialists between different daimyo territories. Merchants who could navigate the complex political relationships between competing powers while providing essential services found themselves in positions of unprecedented influence and prosperity, often serving as informal diplomatic intermediaries between potential allies or enemies. The most successful commercial families accumulated wealth that rivaled that of minor daimyo, while developing expertise in financial management and international trade that proved essential for supporting the increasingly expensive military establishments that characterized Sengoku warfare. The emergence of powerful regional coalitions during the 1560s and 1570s reflected the growing recognition among daimyo that individual territories, regardless of their military strength or economic resources, could not survive indefinitely against coordinated opposition from multiple enemies. The formation of these alliances required sophisticated diplomatic skills and careful attention to the balance of advantages and obligations that each participant would receive from cooperative arrangements. Successful coalition building depended on identifying mutual interests that transcended immediate territorial disputes, while creating enforcement mechanisms that could prevent defection when short-term incentives favoured abandoning Allied commitments. The fragmented political landscape that had emerged from the Onin War's devastation created unprecedented opportunities for ambitious military leaders who possessed both the vision to imagine unified national control and the practical capabilities necessary to transform such dreams into reality. By 1573, when Oda Nobunaga finally succeeded in driving the last Ashikaga shogun from Kyoto, the traditional feudal order had been so thoroughly discredited that even the pretense of central authority had become meaningless. Provincial daimyo ruled their territories as independent kingdoms, maintaining their own laws, currencies and military forces while engaging in constant warfare that prevented any single power from achieving decisive dominance. Into this chaos stepped three remarkable figures whose combined efforts would fundamentally transform Japan from a collection of warring states into a unified nation under centralized control. Oda Nobunaga's approach to military conquest differed radically from conventional warrior practices through his systematic employment of overwhelming force against any opposition, regardless of its religious or political character. Where previous military leaders had typically sought to minimize casualties and preserve existing social structures while achieving their immediate objectives, Nobunaga demonstrated a ruthless willingness to destroy entire institutions if they posed obstacles to his expansion plans. His campaigns against the Ikoiki religious communities during the 1570s exemplified this approach through their unprecedented scale and thoroughness, as his forces systematically eliminated not only armed resistance but also the economic and social foundations that had sustained these Buddhist confederations for generations. The siege of Ishiyama Honganji, which lasted from 1570 to 1580, represented the most sustained military operation of Nobunaga's career and demonstrated his capacity for long-term strategic planning that could coordinate multiple objectives simultaneously. The fortress temple complex, located at the mouth of the Yodo River, where it emptied into Osaka Bay, commanded crucial transportation routes while serving as the administrative center for Jodo Shinshu Buddhist communities throughout central Japan. The temple's massive defensive works, constructed over several decades using donations from thousands of faithful believers, included stone walls over 30 feet high, multiple moats fed by river water, and elaborate systems of underground tunnels that allowed defenders to move reinforcements and supplies without exposure to enemy fire. Nobunaga's assault on this stronghold required innovations in siege warfare that combined traditional Japanese methods with techniques adapted from European military manuals brought by Portuguese missionaries and traders. His engineers constructed massive earthworks that gradually extended closer to the temple walls while providing protected positions for artillery pieces and firearm units that could maintain continuous pressure on the defenders. The use of naval blockades to prevent supply shipments from reaching the besieged garrison represented a level of strategic coordination that few Japanese commanders had previously attempted, requiring cooperation between land forces and specially constructed warships that could operate effectively in the confined waters of Osaka Bay. The fortress's eventual surrender resulted not from successful assault, but from the systematic strangulation of its supply lines and the gradual erosion of defender morale through constant bombardment and the knowledge that no relief force would arrive to break the siege. The terms of capitulation that Nobunaga imposed reflected his understanding that religious institutions posed long-term threats to political stability that could only be eliminated through complete destruction of their organizational capabilities. Rather than accepting the traditional tribute payments and formal submission that had characterized previous conflicts with religious establishments, Nobunaga demanded the complete dismantling of the Jodo Shinshu administrative structure and the exile of its leadership to distant provinces where they could not reconstitute their influence. The destruction of Enryaku-ji Temple on Mount Hiei in 1571 provided an even more dramatic demonstration of Nobunaga's willingness to employ unprecedented violence against religious institutions that challenged his authority. The ancient Buddhist monastery, which had maintained its independence for over 800 years through a combination of spiritual prestige and military power, commanded strategic positions overlooking Kyoto while controlling vast landed estates throughout the surrounding provinces. The temple's warrior monks, known as Sohei, had intervened repeatedly in political conflicts during the late Heian and Kamakura periods, using their military capabilities to influence succession disputes and policy decisions that affected their institutional interests. Nobunaga's assault on Mount Hiei began before dawn on September 30th, 1571, when approximately 30,000 troops surrounded the mountain and began systematic destruction of every building, religious artifact, and human being they encountered. The operation's scope exceeded anything in Japanese military history, as Nobunaga's forces burned over 3,000 structures, while killing an estimated 4,000 monks, servants, and pilgrims who had sought sanctuary within the temple complex. The complete elimination of this ancient institution, which had been considered inviolable by previous military leaders, sent unmistakable messages to other religious establishments about the consequences of opposing Nobunaga's expansion plans. The psychological impact of these religious campaigns extended far beyond their immediate military objectives to transform contemporary understanding of legitimate authority and acceptable methods of political control. Traditional Japanese warfare had operated according to implicit rules that protected certain categories of non-combatants, while preserving religious institutions that provided spiritual services to both sides in any conflict. Nobunaga's systematic violation of these conventions demonstrated that effective power could override traditional constraints when wielded by leaders who possessed sufficient military capability and political determination to ignore conventional limitations on their behaviour. The technological innovations that enabled these military successes reflected Nobunaga's systematic approach to adopting and improving foreign weapons and tactics that could provide decisive advantages over enemies who remained committed to traditional methods. His firearms units, initially organised according to Portuguese military manuals, evolved through practical experience into uniquely Japanese formations that combined European discipline with indigenous tactical flexibility. The development of specialised ammunition types, including incendiary rounds designed to start fires in wooden fortifications and explosive shells that could breach stone walls, required technical expertise that Nobunaga cultivated through generous patronage of craftsmen and engineers who could solve specific military problems. The establishment of centralized armament production facilities represented another crucial innovation that distinguished Nobunaga's military organization from conventional daimyo armies that relied on individual warriors to provide their own equipment. The massive workshops constructed at Azuki and other strategic locations employed hundreds of specialized craftsmen who could produce standardized weapons, armor, and ammunition according to precise specifications that ensured uniform quality and interchangeability of components. These facilities required substantial capital investments and sophisticated management systems, but they provided military advantages that justified their costs through improved battlefield performance and reduced logistical complications during extended campaigns. Nobunaga's administrative innovations proved equally revolutionary in their departure from traditional feudal practices and their emphasis on practical efficiency over hereditary privilege or ceremonial precedent. His appointment of capable administrators regardless of their social background or family connections created governmental systems that could respond effectively to rapidly changing military and political circumstances while maintaining the detailed record-keeping necessary for managing complex territorial holdings. The implementation of standardized weights, measures, and currency systems throughout his expanding domain facilitated commercial activities while providing the economic integration necessary for supporting large-scale military operations across multiple provinces. The systematic land surveys that Nobunaga ordered in conquered territories provided precise information about agricultural productivity, population distribution, and resource availability that enabled more efficient tax collection while eliminating the traditional privileges and exemptions that had characterized the previous feudal system. These surveys, conducted by teams of specially trained officials who measured fields with standardized instruments and recorded their findings in uniform formats, created comprehensive databases that allowed central administrators to make informed decisions about resource allocation and military planning. The resulting tax assessments, based on actual productive capacity rather than historical precedent or political negotiation, generated revenues that far exceeded what previous collection methods had achieved. The construction of road networks and communication systems that could support rapid military movements and administrative coordination represented another crucial innovation that distinguished Nobunaga's territorial organization from conventional daimyo domains. The systematic improvement of existing transportation routes, combined with the construction of new roads that connected strategic locations according to military rather than commercial priorities, created infrastructure capabilities that allowed armies to move between distant theatres of operation with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The establishment of relay stations equipped with fresh horses and supplies enabled messengers to maintain communication between central headquarters and provincial commanders across distances that had previously required weeks of travel time. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's rise from Ashigaru foot soldier to supreme military commander exemplified the social mobility that became possible under Nobunaga's merit-based administrative system, while his subsequent policies as national hegemon reflected both continuation and modification of his former master's revolutionary approaches to governance. Born into a peasant family in Owari province, Hideyoshi possessed no hereditary claim to warrior status or territorial authority, but his exceptional intelligence and administrative capabilities enabled him to advance through Nobunaga's military hierarchy until he commanded major independent operations. His success in capturing Takamatsu Castle in 1582 through the innovative technique of flooding the fortress by damming a nearby river demonstrated the tactical creativity that had characterized his entire career. Nobunaga's assassination at Honnoji Temple in June 1582 created a succession crisis that Hideyoshi resolved through a combination of military action and political maneuvering that established him as the dominant figure among Nobunaga's former vassals. His victory over Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki, achieved through forced marches that brought his army from distant Bitchu province to the Kyoto area in unprecedented time, demonstrated both his strategic understanding and his troops' exceptional discipline and loyalty. The subsequent negotiations with other Nobunaga generals, particularly Shibata Katsuya and Tokugawa Ieyasu, required diplomatic skills that enabled Hideyoshi to forge coalitions while isolating potential rivals who might challenge his emerging authority. The completion of national unification under Hideyoshi's leadership involved military campaigns that systematically eliminated the remaining independent daimyo while implementing administrative reforms that would prevent future fragmentation of central authority. His conquest of Kyushu during 1586 to 1587 required coordinating multiple armies across difficult terrain while negotiating the complex political relationships between local powers who had maintained their independence through centuries of shifting alliances and territorial disputes. The Shimazu family's final submission at Kagoshima marked the end of autonomous rule in Japan's southernmost regions, while demonstrating Hideyoshi's capacity for projecting military power across vast distances despite significant logistical challenges. The siege of Odawara in 1590 represented the culmination of Hideyoshi's unification campaigns through its elimination of the Hojo family, the last major daimyo house that had maintained effective independence from central control. The massive fortress complex that the Hojo had constructed in the Kanto region incorporated the most advanced defensive technologies available, including multiple defensive lines, sophisticated water management systems, and provisions for withstanding extended sieges. Hideyoshi's successful reduction of this stronghold required mobilizing over 200,000 troops while coordinating naval operations that prevented supply shipments from reaching the besieged garrison through coastal routes. The implementation of the sword hunt policy beginning in 1588 represented Hideyoshi's most significant departure from traditional warrior practices through its systematic disarmament of the non-samurai population and the rigid enforcement of class distinctions that would define Japanese social organization for the next 3 centuries. The Katanagari orders required all farmers, artisans, and merchants to surrender their weapons to government officials who melted down the collected swords and spears to provide metal for constructing a massive Buddha statue at Kyoto's Todaiji Temple. This policy served multiple purposes. It eliminated potential sources of armed resistance to central authority while creating clear legal distinctions between the warrior class and other social groups. The enforcement of these weapons confiscation orders required extensive bureaucratic machinery that could identify and collect privately owned arms while preventing the emergence of black market trade in forbidden weapons. Teams of government inspectors, accompanied by military escorts, conducted systematic searches of rural communities while offering rewards for information about concealed weapons and severe punishments for those who attempted to evade the collection requirements. The policy's success depended on cooperation from local administrators who understood their community's social dynamics and could identify individuals most likely to possess hidden weapons or resist government orders. The rigid class separation system that Hideyoshi implemented alongside the sword hunt created legal frameworks that prevented social mobility between the 4 officially recognized status groups: samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants. These regulations specified appropriate occupations, residential locations, clothing styles, and even dietary restrictions for each class, while prohibiting marriage or adoption across status boundaries. The system's enforcement required detailed population registers that recorded every individual's official class designation, along with their family relationships and economic activities, creating administrative databases that enabled government officials to monitor compliance with social regulations. The Korean invasions that Hideyoshi launched in 1592 reflected his grandiose ambitions for continental expansion, while demonstrating both the military capabilities that Japanese unification had created and the logistical limitations that would ultimately doom these overseas adventures. The initial invasion force of approximately 160,000 troops represented the largest military expedition in Japanese history, requiring unprecedented coordination between multiple daimyo armies while maintaining supply lines across hundreds of miles of ocean. The rapid conquest of Seoul and Pyongyang during the campaign's opening months demonstrated Japanese military superiority over Korean forces that had not experienced major warfare for generations. However, the intervention of Ming Chinese armies beginning in early 1593 transformed the conflict from a conquest campaign into a prolonged war of attrition that strained Japanese resources while producing minimal strategic gains. The Chinese forces, numbering over 100,000 experienced troops equipped with advanced artillery and supported by extensive supply networks, possessed military capabilities that matched or exceeded those of the Japanese invaders. The resulting stalemate forced Japanese armies to maintain defensive positions in hostile territory, while dealing with constant harassment from Korean guerrilla forces and regular attacks from combined Chinese-Korean armies. The naval warfare that characterized much of the Korean conflict revealed significant weaknesses in Japanese maritime capabilities, despite their advantages in land combat. Korean Admiral Yi Sun-sin's innovative turtle ships, equipped with iron plating and advanced artillery pieces, proved devastatingly effective against Japanese transport vessels and warships that had been designed primarily for coastal operations rather than extended naval campaigns. The destruction of Japanese supply fleets at battles such as Hansan Island severely compromised the invasion army's logistical support, while demonstrating the crucial importance of naval superiority for overseas military operations. The enormous financial costs of maintaining large armies in Korea for 7 years exhausted the resources that Hideyoshi had accumulated through domestic conquest and administrative reform, while creating political tensions among daimyo, who bore the primary burden of supporting the overseas campaigns. The requirement that provincial lords provide troops, supplies and financial support for operations that produced no territorial gains or other tangible benefits generated resentment that would influence subsequent political developments. The death toll from combat, disease and logistical failures reached catastrophic levels, with some estimates suggesting that over 100,000 Japanese soldiers died during the 2 invasion attempts. Tokugawa Ieyasu's emergence as the dominant figure following Hideyoshi's death in 1598 resulted from his careful positioning during the Korean campaigns and his subsequent political maneuvering during the succession crisis that divided Hideyoshi's former vassals into competing factions. Unlike other major daimyo who had committed substantial resources to the overseas adventures, Ieyasu had maintained most of his forces in Japan while providing only minimal support for the Korean operations. This strategic restraint preserved his military strength and financial resources, while other potential rivals exhausted themselves in futile continental warfare. The Battle of Sekigahara, on October 21, 1600, determined the political future of unified Japan through a single decisive engagement that lasted less than 6 hours but involved over 150,000 warriors representing virtually every major daimyo family in the country. The battlefield, located in a narrow valley between mountains that controlled the main transportation route between eastern and western Japan, provided tactical advantages that Ieyasu exploited. Through careful positioning of his forces and successful negotiations with potential enemies who switched sides at crucial moments during the fighting. The Eastern army that Ieyasu commanded included not only his hereditary Tokugawa vassals, but also former Toyotomi supporters who had concluded that their interests lay with the emerging victor rather than with Ishida Mitsunari's Western Army coalition. The defection of Kobayakawa Hideaki and several other Western commanders at the battle's climax transformed what might have been a closely contested engagement into a complete rout that eliminated organised resistance to Tokugawa authority. The systematic pursuit and destruction of fleeing Western Army units ensured that no significant military force remained to challenge Ieyasu's claim to national supremacy. The establishment of the Edo shogunate in 1603 represented the culmination of 30 years of revolutionary change that had transformed Japan from a collection of independent territories into a unified nation under centralized military control. Ieyasu's decision to locate his capital at Edo, a relatively small fishing village on the Kanto Plain's eastern edge, reflected both strategic considerations about controlling Japan's most productive agricultural region and symbolic recognition that the new political order would differ fundamentally from previous arrangements that had maintained ceremonial connections to Kyoto's imperial court. The transformation of Edo from a modest fishing settlement into the administrative centre of a unified Japan required unprecedented urban planning and construction projects that would reshape the physical landscape while establishing the institutional foundations for 3 centuries of Tokugawa rule. When Ieyasu first surveyed the marshy terrain surrounding Edo Bay in 1590, he envisioned not merely a regional stronghold, but a purpose-built capital that could accommodate the complex administrative machinery necessary for governing a nation of approximately 28 million people. The massive earth-moving operations that began immediately after Sekigahara involved redirecting rivers, draining swamplands, and constructing artificial islands that would provide stable foundations for the castle complex and surrounding urban districts that housed the shogunal bureaucracy. The architectural centerpiece of this transformation was Edo Castle itself, a fortress complex that dwarfed even Hideyoshi's magnificent Osaka castle through its systematic integration of defensive capabilities with administrative functions on an unprecedented scale. The castle's spiral design forced visitors to traverse multiple defensive rings while ascending gradually toward the central keep, creating a physical manifestation of hierarchical authority that reinforced political relationships through spatial organization. The massive stone foundations, some individual blocks weighing over 10 tons, were transported from quarries hundreds of miles away using specially constructed barges and road networks that demonstrated the Tokugawa regime's capacity for coordinating large-scale engineering projects across multiple provinces. The implementation of the Sankin Kotai system, beginning in 1635, represented the most ingenious mechanism for controlling daimyo autonomy, while simultaneously developing the infrastructure and economic integration necessary for maintaining centralized authority. Under these regulations, all daimyo were required to maintain permanent residences in Edo, where they would spend alternate years in attendance upon the shogun, while their wives and children remained as permanent hostages in the capital, regardless of their husband's and father's location. This system transformed potential military rivals into court nobles, whose status depended on their ability to navigate complex ceremonial protocols while competing for shogunal favour through displays of loyalty and cultural sophistication. The logistical requirements of Sankin Kotai created massive transportation networks that connected every corner of Japan to the Tokugawa capital through regularly maintained highways, designed to accommodate the elaborate processions that accompanied daimyo movements between their domains and Edo residences. The Tokaido, the principal route connecting Edo with Kyoto and Osaka, required constant maintenance of 53 post stations that provided accommodation, fresh horses, and supplies for the thousands of travellers who used the highway each month. Each daimyo procession included not only the lord himself, but hundreds of retainers, servants, and guards whose numbers reflected their master's status, while creating economic opportunities for innkeepers, merchants, and craftsmen along the route. The financial burden of maintaining dual residences while funding elaborate travel ceremonies effectively prevented daimyo from accumulating the resources necessary for military challenges to central authority. A typical Sankin Kotai procession for major daimyo required several hundred participants, dozens of horses, and carefully coordinated logistics that consumed substantial portions of domain revenues. The Maeda family of Kaga province, among the wealthiest daimyo houses, spent an estimated 40% of their annual income on Edo residence expenses and travel costs, leaving insufficient resources for military modernization or territorial expansion that might threaten Tokugawa supremacy. The cultural dimensions of Sankin Kotai proved equally significant in transforming warrior society from a military class focused on combat readiness into a bureaucratic elite, whose status depended on administrative competence and cultural refinement. Daimyo residences in Edo became centres of artistic patronage and intellectual activity, where provincial lords competed to demonstrate their sophistication through tea ceremony mastery, poetry composition, and scholarly pursuits that had previously been associated primarily with court nobility. The necessity of navigating complex social protocols during formal audiences and ceremonial occasions required skills that differed fundamentally from traditional warrior capabilities, creating pressure for educational reforms that emphasized civilian accomplishments over military training. The establishment of the four-class system provided the ideological framework for a social hierarchy that legitimized Tokugawa authority, while preventing the emergence of alternative power centers that might challenge established order. The official ranking of samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants reflected Neo-Confucian principles that valued productive labor over commercial activity, while maintaining clear distinctions between rulers and subjects. This theoretical framework, derived from Chinese political philosophy but adapted to Japanese circumstances, provided intellectual justification for existing social arrangements while creating legal categories that could be enforced through government regulation and social pressure. The practical implementation of class distinctions required extensive bureaucratic machinery that could monitor compliance with regulations governing everything from clothing styles and residential architecture to marriage partners and occupational choices. Sumptuary laws specified appropriate fabrics, colours, and decorative elements for each social class, while prohibiting the adoption of styles associated with higher status groups. Farmers were restricted to cotton and hemp clothing in subdued colours, while merchants faced particularly detailed restrictions that prevented them from displaying their wealth through conspicuous consumption that might challenge samurai social superiority despite inferior economic circumstances. The codification of these social boundaries created legal frameworks that reinforced existing hierarchies while preventing the social mobility that had characterized the Sengoku period's fluid political environment. Marriage regulations prohibited unions between different social classes while requiring official approval for adoptions that might alter family status or inheritance patterns. The registration of all households in detailed population surveys created administrative databases that enabled government officials to track individual compliance with class regulations, while identifying unauthorized attempts to change social position or occupational category. The transformation of samurai from professional warriors into civilian bureaucrats represented one of the most significant social changes in Japanese history, requiring fundamental alterations in education, lifestyle, and cultural values that had defined warrior identity for centuries. The elimination of warfare as a regular feature of Japanese life meant that traditional military skills became largely ceremonial accomplishments rather than practical necessities, forcing samurai families to develop alternative sources of status and income that could justify their privileged position within the social hierarchy. The development of castle towns throughout Japan created urban environments where samurai could pursue bureaucratic careers while maintaining their social distinction from merchant and artisan populations. These planned communities, constructed around daimyo residences according to standardized layouts that reflected Confucian principles of social organization, provided employment opportunities for educated samurai who could serve as administrators, teachers, and technical specialists within domain governments. The physical separation of samurai residential districts from commercial areas reinforced social boundaries while creating distinct urban spaces that reflected hierarchical relationships through architectural design and spatial organization. The educational reforms that accompanied this social transformation emphasized classical Chinese learning and administrative skills rather than military training and combat techniques that had previously defined samurai culture. Domain schools established throughout Japan provided instruction in Confucian philosophy, Chinese literature, and practical subjects such as mathematics and accounting that prepared young samurai for bureaucratic careers. The curriculum's focus on moral cultivation and intellectual development reflected Neo-Confucian beliefs about the relationship between personal character and effective governance, while creating shared cultural standards that unified the samurai class across regional boundaries. The implementation of Sakoku policies beginning in the 1630s reflected Tokugawa concerns about foreign influences that might destabilize the carefully constructed social and political order that had emerged from decades of civil warfare. The exclusion of European missionaries and the severe restriction of international trade represented systematic attempts to control information flow and prevent the introduction of ideas or technologies that might challenge existing authority structures. The persecution of Christian communities, which culminated in the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 to 1638, demonstrated the regime's willingness to employ extreme violence against religious movements that offered alternative sources of loyalty and authority. The destruction of Hara Castle during the Shimabara siege required mobilizing over 100,000 troops against approximately 27,000 Christian rebels who had fortified themselves in the abandoned fortress on the Shimabara Peninsula. The rebels, primarily peasants and ronin who had been driven to desperation by excessive taxation and religious persecution, demonstrated remarkable military competence despite their inferior numbers and equipment. Their effective use of firearms and disciplined defensive tactics prolonged the siege for several months while inflicting substantial casualties on government forces that had expected rapid victory over poorly armed insurgents. The rebellion's suppression marked the end of Christian influence in Japan, while establishing precedents for dealing with religious and social movements that challenged Tokugawa authority. The systematic execution of captured rebels, including women and children who had participated in the defense, demonstrated the regime's determination to eliminate any trace of Christian organization or belief. The subsequent prohibition of all Christian literature and religious artifacts, combined with the requirement that all Japanese families register with Buddhist temples, created surveillance mechanisms that could detect and prevent the revival of forbidden religious practices. The restriction of foreign trade to the single port of Nagasaki, where Dutch and Chinese merchants operated under strict government supervision, enabled the Tokugawa regime to control the flow of foreign goods and ideas while maintaining access to essential imports such as silk, sugar, and medicinal products. The artificial island of Dejima, constructed specifically to house Dutch traders, created a controlled environment where international commerce could continue without allowing foreign influences to penetrate Japanese society. The elaborate regulations governing these trade relationships specified acceptable goods, limited the number of foreign residents, and required detailed reporting of all commercial transactions to government officials. The economic consequences of Sakoku policies included both benefits and costs that would influence Japanese development for the remainder of the Edo period. The elimination of foreign competition protected domestic industries while encouraging technological innovation and quality improvement that made Japanese products competitive in restricted markets. The development of sophisticated textile production, metalworking and ceramic industries created employment opportunities while generating tax revenues that supported government operations. However, the restriction of international trade also limited access to foreign technologies and raw materials that might have accelerated economic development and military modernization. The growth of domestic commerce during the early Edo period reflected the peace and stability the Tokugawa policies had created, while demonstrating the economic potential that could be realized through effective governance and social order. The elimination of warfare and the standardization of weights, measures, and currency systems facilitated trade between different regions, while reducing the transaction costs that had previously limited commercial development. The construction of improved transportation networks, including both highways and coastal shipping routes, enabled merchants to move goods efficiently across long distances while creating integrated markets that could support specialized production and regional economic development. The emergence of Osaka as Japan's commercial center reflected the city's strategic location at the intersection of major transportation routes, while demonstrating the economic integration that characterized the early Edo period. The city's rice market became the national center for grain trading, with prices established in Osaka serving as benchmarks for agricultural transactions throughout Japan. The development of sophisticated financial instruments, including promissory notes and credit arrangements, that enabled long-distance trade without physical transportation of currency, created banking systems that could support increasingly complex commercial relationships between merchants in different regions. The urbanization that accompanied commercial development created new social environments where traditional class boundaries became more fluid despite official regulations that maintained legal distinctions between social groups. Edo's population grew from approximately 100,000 in 1600 to over 1 million by 1700, making it one of the world's largest cities, while creating unprecedented concentrations of people from different social backgrounds living in close proximity. The development of distinct urban districts that catered to different social classes created opportunities for cultural exchange and economic cooperation that transcended official social boundaries while maintaining the appearance of hierarchical order. The entertainment districts that emerged in major cities provided venues where merchants, artisans, and even samurai could interact in environments that temporarily suspended normal social restrictions, while creating new forms of cultural expression that reflected urban sensibilities. The development of kabuki theatre, ukiyo-e woodblock printing, and other popular arts reflected the aesthetic preferences and economic capabilities of urban populations who possessed both the leisure time and disposable income necessary for supporting professional entertainers and artists. These cultural innovations created distinctly Japanese art forms that combined traditional techniques with contemporary themes while appealing to audiences that included members of multiple social classes. The technological developments that occurred during this period of isolation demonstrated Japanese capabilities for innovation and adaptation that could operate independently of foreign influences while building upon existing knowledge and skills. The improvement of agricultural techniques, including the development of new crop varieties and more efficient farming methods, increased food production sufficiently to support growing urban populations while generating agricultural surpluses that could be invested in other economic activities. The advancement of manufacturing technologies, particularly in textiles and metalworking, created products that met both domestic demand and the limited export opportunities available through controlled foreign trade. The administrative foundations that had enabled Tokugawa control during the 17th century provided the structural framework for an unprecedented cultural and economic flowering that would transform Japan into one of the world's most sophisticated societies by 1750. The Genroku period, spanning roughly from 1688 to 1704, marked the emergence of a distinctly urban culture that challenged traditional assumptions about social hierarchy while creating new forms of artistic expression that reflected the economic vitality and intellectual sophistication of Japan's growing merchant communities. The concentration of wealth in major cities, particularly Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, generated unprecedented demand for entertainment, luxury goods, and cultural refinement that could no longer be satisfied by the austere aesthetic traditions associated with samurai culture or the formal ceremonial practices of the imperial court. The development of kabuki theatre during this period represented a revolutionary departure from the highly stylized no-drama that had dominated Japanese theatrical tradition for centuries, where no performances appealed primarily to educated elites who possessed the classical learning necessary to appreciate subtle literary allusions and symbolic representations. Kabuki emerged as a popular entertainment form that combined spectacular visual effects with contemporary social commentary in ways that resonated with urban audiences regardless of their educational background or social status. The elaborate costumes, featuring brilliant silk fabrics dyed in colours that violated sumptuary laws restricting common address, created visual spectacles that challenged official social boundaries while demonstrating the economic power of merchant patrons who funded these productions. The female impersonators who specialised in onagata roles developed performance techniques of extraordinary sophistication that transformed gender representation into high art through their meticulous attention to movement, voice modulation, and costume design. These actors studied feminine behaviour with scientific precision, observing how women of the different social classes walked, gestured and spoke in various situations, then refined these observations into stylized performances that captured essential qualities of femininity while transcending the limitations of realistic imitation. The most accomplished Onagata performers commanded salaries that exceeded those of many samurai officials, while attracting devoted followings among both male and female audience members who appreciated their artistic achievements. The physical theatres constructed to house kabuki performances incorporated architectural innovations that maximised audience capacity while creating intimate connections between performers and spectators through carefully designed sightlines and acoustic properties. The hanamichi, or flower path, that extended through the audience area allowed actors to make dramatic entrances and exits while passing directly among seated viewers, creating moments of intense proximity that heightened emotional engagement with the unfolding drama. The use of trapdoors, revolving stages, and elaborate mechanical devices enabled rapid scene changes and special effects that enhanced the theatrical experience while demonstrating the technical sophistication that Japanese craftsmen could achieve when supported by adequate financial resources. The emergence of ukiyo-e woodblock printing as a major art form reflected both technological innovations in printing techniques and the development of mass markets for affordable artistic reproductions that could bring sophisticated visual culture within reach of ordinary urban residents. The term ukiyo, literally meaning floating world, captured the ephemeral nature of contemporary urban life while celebrating the pleasures and experiences that characterised merchant society during this period of unprecedented prosperity. Artists like Hishikawa Morinobu pioneered techniques for creating single-sheet prints that could be produced in large quantities while maintaining artistic quality sufficient to satisfy discriminating collectors who appreciated both aesthetic merit and technical excellence. The collaborative nature of ukiyo-e production involved complex relationships between artists who created original designs, carvers who translated these images into wooden printing blocks, and publishers who coordinated the entire process while marketing finished prints to diverse audiences with varying aesthetic preferences and financial capabilities. The most successful publishers developed sophisticated understanding of market demand, commissioning series of prints that featured popular actors, beautiful courtesans, or scenic locations that appealed to specific customer segments, while maintaining production schedules that could respond quickly to changing fashion trends or current events that captured public attention. The technical innovations that enabled high-quality colour printing represented remarkable achievements in precision manufacturing that required coordination between multiple specialised craftsmen working with materials whose properties had been refined through generations of experimentation. The development of water-based pigments that could produce brilliant colours while maintaining stability over time involved chemical knowledge that Japanese artisans had accumulated through centuries of textile dyeing and ceramic glazing experience. The registration techniques that ensured precise alignment of multiple colour blocks demanded mathematical precision and mechanical skill that transformed printing from a simple reproduction process into a sophisticated manufacturing operation capable of producing works of genuine artistic merit. The subject matter of ukiyo-e prints reflected the social dynamics and cultural interests of urban society during the High Edo period, documenting everything from theatrical performances and pleasure quarter activities to seasonal festivals and famous scenic locations that had become popular destinations for domestic tourism. The bijinga genre, featuring portraits of beautiful women, created idealized representations of feminine beauty that influenced fashion trends and aesthetic standards, while providing insights into contemporary social attitudes about gender roles and sexual relationships. These prints often depicted courtesans and geishas whose elaborate hairstyles, makeup techniques, and clothing choices represented the height of urban sophistication, while challenging conventional moral standards through their celebration of pleasure and sensual experience. The Yakusha-e category, focusing on kabuki actors in their most famous roles, created a form of celebrity culture that enabled audiences to maintain connections with their favourite performers between theatrical seasons while preserving visual records of memorable performances that might otherwise have been forgotten. These actor portraits often captured specific moments of dramatic intensity, showing performers in characteristic poses or facial expressions that had become associated with particular roles or emotional states. The most skilled artists could convey not only physical likeness, but also the personality and artistic style that distinguished individual actors from their colleagues, creating portraits that functioned as both artistic achievements and historical documents. The economic foundations that supported this cultural flowering reflected fundamental changes in Japan's productive capacity and commercial organization that had occurred during the previous century of peace and political stability. Agricultural improvements, including the introduction of new rice varieties from China and the development of more efficient irrigation systems, had increased food production sufficiently to support growing urban populations, while generating surpluses that could be invested in manufacturing and commercial activities. The expansion of cultivated land through reclamation projects that drained swamps and terraced hillsides added millions of acres to Japan's agricultural base, while creating employment opportunities for rural populations that might otherwise have migrated to cities in search of economic opportunities. The development of cash crop production, particularly cotton cultivation in the Kinai region around Osaka, created agricultural specialization that enabled farmers to participate directly in commercial markets rather than simply producing rice for tax payments and subsistence consumption. Cotton farming required different techniques and seasonal labor patterns compared to rice cultivation, but it offered higher profits per unit of land while creating raw materials for textile industries that had become increasingly important components of Japan's domestic economy. The success of cotton production encouraged experimentation with other commercial crops, including indigo for dye production, tobacco for domestic consumption, and various oil-bearing plants that could supply urban markets with cooking oils and lamp fuels. The proto-industrialization that emerged during this period involved the development of manufacturing systems that combined traditional craft techniques with organizational innovations that could achieve economies of scale while maintaining quality standards that satisfied discriminating consumers. The textile industry in regions like Nishijin near Kyoto employed thousands of skilled weavers who produced silk fabrics of extraordinary complexity and beauty, using techniques that had been refined over generations of artistic development. These workshops operated according to sophisticated division of labor principles that allowed individual craftsmen to specialize in specific aspects of production, while contributing to finished products that exceeded what any single artisan could have accomplished working independently. The sake brewing industry exemplified the technological sophistication that Japanese manufacturers could achieve through systematic experimentation and quality improvement over extended periods. The development of precise fermentation control techniques, involving careful monitoring of temperature, humidity, and timing throughout the brewing process, enabled the production of alcoholic beverages that varied significantly in flavor, aroma, and alcohol content according to specific regional preferences and seasonal requirements. The most successful breweries developed proprietary methods that were closely guarded trade secrets, while building reputations for consistent quality that enabled them to command premium prices in competitive markets. The emergence of a national market system during this period reflected improvements in transportation infrastructure and communication networks that enabled merchants to coordinate commercial activities across vast distances while managing the complex logistics required for moving goods between regions with different seasonal production cycles and consumer preferences. The development of coastal shipping routes that connected major ports created efficient transportation systems for bulk commodities like rice, salt, and timber that formed the foundation of interregional trade. These maritime networks required substantial investments in shipbuilding technology and navigation expertise, but they provided transportation costs that were significantly lower than overland alternatives while enabling the movement of goods that would have been prohibitively expensive to transport by other means. The financial innovations that supported this expanding commercial activity included the development of sophisticated credit systems and banking arrangements that could facilitate long-distance trade without requiring the physical transportation of currency across dangerous or inconvenient routes. Merchant houses in major cities established correspondent relationships with trading partners in distant regions, creating networks of mutual trust and shared information that enabled complex transactions involving multiple parties and extended time periods. The use of promissory notes and letters of credit reduced the risks associated with long-distance commerce, while enabling merchants to leverage their capital more effectively through financial instruments that had been adapted from Chinese and European models to suit Japanese commercial practices. The rise of the shonen class during this period represented a fundamental challenge to official social hierarchies that placed merchants at the bottom of the four-class system, despite their growing economic power and cultural influence. Wealthy merchant families accumulated fortunes that dwarfed the incomes of many samurai officials while developing lifestyles that emphasized luxury consumption and cultural refinement in ways that directly contradicted sumptuary laws designed to maintain visible distinctions between social classes. The most successful merchants built elaborate residences that incorporated architectural features traditionally reserved for samurai or court nobility, while furnishing these homes with art collections and luxury goods that demonstrated their sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. The cultural patronage activities of wealthy merchants created alternative sources of artistic support that operated independently of official government sponsorship while reflecting commercial rather than political priorities in their selection of projects and artists. Merchant families commissioned major works of art, funded theatrical productions, and supported literary publications that celebrated urban culture and commercial success rather than traditional warrior values or classical Chinese learning. This patronage created opportunities for artists and entertainers who might not have found support within conventional cultural institutions, while encouraging artistic innovations that reflected contemporary social realities rather than historical precedents or foreign models. The educational expansion that occurred during this period reflected both government initiatives designed to improve administrative efficiency and private efforts to provide practical training that could enhance economic opportunities for ambitious individuals regardless of their social background. The establishment of teirakoya, or temple schools, throughout Japan created educational opportunities that extended far beyond the samurai class to include merchant and artisan families who recognized that literacy and numerical skills had become essential requirements for success in an increasingly complex commercial environment. These schools typically operated in Buddhist temples using donated space and equipment, while employing teachers who combined religious instruction with practical subjects like reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic accounting procedures. The curriculum of teirakoya schools emphasized practical skills that students could apply immediately in commercial or craft activities rather than the classical Chinese learning that dominated samurai education. Students learned to read and write using texts that dealt with contemporary business practices, legal procedures, and technical information rather than ancient philosophical works or historical chronicles that had little relevance to their daily lives. The arithmetic instruction included techniques for calculating interest rates, currency conversions, and measurement systems that were essential for commercial transactions, while providing mathematical foundations that could support more advanced technical training in specialized crafts or manufacturing processes. The Han schools established by domain governments provided more advanced education for samurai children, while creating institutional frameworks that could adapt Confucian educational principles to the practical requirements of bureaucratic administration in peacetime society. These schools developed standardized curricula that combined classical learning with practical subjects like mathematics, geography, and technical skills that were necessary for effective governance in an increasingly complex administrative environment. The emphasis on moral cultivation and character development reflected Neo-Confucian beliefs about the relationship between personal virtue and political effectiveness, while creating shared cultural values that unified the samurai class across regional boundaries. The literacy rates that resulted from this educational expansion reached levels that were unprecedented in world history for societies that had not experienced widespread industrialization or democratic political development. Contemporary estimates suggest that male literacy rates in urban areas exceeded 80% by the mid-18th century, while rural literacy rates approached 40%, despite the absence of compulsory education laws or government mandates requiring basic education for all citizens. These achievements reflected both the practical value that Japanese society placed on literacy skills and the institutional innovations that made education accessible to broad segments of the population, regardless of their social status or economic circumstances. The publishing industry that emerged to serve this literate population created mass markets for books, periodicals, and popular literature that reflected contemporary interests and concerns rather than traditional scholarly or religious themes. Commercial publishers developed sophisticated understanding of reader preferences while creating distribution networks that could deliver printed materials to customers throughout Japan, despite the geographical barriers and transportation limitations that had previously restricted information flow. The success of popular fiction, particularly the works of authors like Ihara Saikaku, who wrote about merchant life and urban culture, demonstrated that Japanese readers were eager to consume literature that reflected their own experiences and social environment rather than classical works that dealt with distant historical periods or foreign cultural traditions. The cultural prosperity and economic vitality that had characterized the High Edo period began showing signs of strain by the early 19th century as a series of interconnected crises exposed fundamental weaknesses in the Tokugawa system that had remained hidden during the previous century of unprecedented stability. The rigid social hierarchy and closed economic system that had enabled Japan's remarkable cultural flowering now appeared increasingly inadequate for addressing the complex challenges that emerged from both internal demographic pressures and external threats that would ultimately prove impossible to ignore or deflect through traditional diplomatic means. The Tenpo famine of 1833 to 1837 represented the most severe subsistence crisis Japan had experienced since the establishment of Tokugawa rule, affecting virtually every region of the archipelago through a combination of climatic disasters and administrative failures that reveal the dangerous vulnerability of Japan's agricultural foundation. The crisis began with abnormally cold temperatures and excessive rainfall during the crucial summer growing seasons of 1833 and 1834, conditions that were exacerbated by volcanic ash from Mount Kosai's eruption that blocked sunlight and damaged crops across northeastern Honshu. The resulting harvest failures reduced rice production by an estimated 30 to 40% in the most severely affected regions, while creating cascading effects that disrupted food distribution networks and caused commodity prices to fluctuate wildly throughout the country. The government's response to these agricultural disasters demonstrated both the administrative capabilities that the Tokugawa regime had developed over 2 centuries of rule and the inherent limitations of a system that prioritized political stability over economic flexibility. Domain authorities implemented traditional famine relief measures, including the distribution of stored rice reserves and the temporary suspension of tax collection in the most severely affected areas. But these efforts proved insufficient to address the scale of the crisis. The hand granary system, which had been designed to provide emergency supplies during localized shortages, lacked the capacity to support entire regions experiencing simultaneous harvest failures while maintaining adequate reserves for future emergencies. Rural communities throughout northeastern Japan experienced social upheaval that challenged the fundamental assumptions about peasant compliance and social order that had underpinned Tokugawa governance since the early 17th century. Desperate farming families abandoned their villages in massive numbers, seeking survival through migration to urban areas or less affected rural regions where they might find employment or charitable assistance. These population movements created administrative chaos as local officials struggled to maintain accurate household registers, while dealing with unprecedented numbers of displaced persons who fell outside the normal categories of social classification and bureaucratic control. The urban consequences of rural distress manifested in rice riots that erupted simultaneously in dozens of cities throughout Japan during the spring and summer of 1837, demonstrating a level of coordinated popular resistance that had not been seen since the early years of Tokugawa rule. The Oshio Heihachiro rebellion in Osaka exemplified the dangerous potential for social unrest when economic crisis coincided with principled opposition to government policies from within the samurai class itself. Oshio, a former magistrate and Confucian scholar who had become convinced that official corruption and indifference to popular suffering had violated the moral foundations of legitimate governance, organised an armed uprising that briefly seized control of significant portions of Japan's commercial capital before being suppressed through massive military intervention. The rebellion's suppression required mobilising over 10,000 troops equipped with artillery and firearms against approximately 300 insurgents who had fortified themselves in Osaka's commercial districts while attempting to distribute confiscated rice supplies to starving urban residents. The fighting lasted 3 days and resulted in the destruction of nearly 1/4 of the city's buildings through fires that spread from the initial combat zones to consume entire neighbourhoods of wooden structures that had been constructed without adequate consideration for fire prevention. The physical destruction exceeded anything Osaka had experienced since the Sengoku period wars, while the political implications of armed resistance led by a respected scholar official created profound concerns about the regime's ability to maintain social order during future crises. The investigation that followed Oshio's defeat revealed extensive networks of popular discontent that extended far beyond the immediate participants in the armed uprising, including merchants who'd provided financial support, farmers who'd supplied information about government troop movements, and even some lower-ranking samurai who had expressed sympathy for the rebels' stated objectives. The breadth of this support network suggested that opposition to Tokugawa policies had penetrated much deeper into Japanese society than government officials had previously recognized. While the rebels' success in maintaining popular support despite their ultimate military defeat indicated that traditional methods of social control might prove inadequate for addressing future challenges to established authority. The economic disruptions that accompanied these social upheavals accelerated existing trends toward regional specialization and commercial development that were gradually undermining the agricultural foundations of Tokugawa fiscal policy. The growth of cash crop production, particularly cotton cultivation in western Japan, had created farming communities that depended heavily on market relationships rather than subsistence agriculture, making them vulnerable to price fluctuations and supply disruptions that could occur far from their immediate geographical area. The development of proto-industrial manufacturing in rural areas, including textile production and handicraft activities that supplemented agricultural income, had similarly increased rural dependence on commercial networks that operated according to market principles, rather than the traditional relationships of obligation and mutual assistance that had previously characterized village life. The monetary problems that plagued the Tokugawa government during this period reflected fundamental contradictions between the regime's fiscal requirements and the economic realities of a society that had become increasingly commercialized, despite official policies designed to maintain agricultural primacy. The debasement of gold and silver currency that began during the late 18th century had created inflationary pressures that eroded the purchasing power of fixed samurai stipends, while benefiting merchants and manufacturers who could adjust their prices to reflect changing monetary conditions. The resulting redistribution of wealth from the warrior class to commercial groups undermined the social hierarchy that provided ideological justification for Tokugawa rule, while creating political tensions that proved increasingly difficult to manage through traditional administrative means. The Han debt crisis that emerged during this period demonstrated how thoroughly the daimyo class had become dependent on merchant financiers, despite official social hierarchies that placed warriors above commercial groups in terms of status and political authority. Many domains had accumulated debts that exceeded their annual revenues by factors of 10 or more, creating situations where practical governance decisions were effectively controlled by merchant creditors who possessed the financial leverage necessary to influence policy choices. The most heavily indebted domains found themselves forced to mortgage future tax revenues or sell monopoly rights to commercial groups in exchange for immediate financial relief, creating economic relationships that violated fundamental principles of warrior independence and political autonomy. The intellectual ferment that accompanied these economic and social changes produced new forms of political thought that challenged basic assumptions about legitimate authority and proper governance that had remained largely unquestioned since the early Tokugawa period. The development of kokugaku, or national learning, created scholarly frameworks for questioning Chinese philosophical influences, while emphasizing indigenous Japanese traditions that predated the introduction of foreign ideas and institutions. Scholars like Motoori Norinaga and Hirata Atsutene developed sophisticated critiques of Neo-Confucian political theory, while advocating for restoration of direct imperial rule that would eliminate the warrior intermediaries who had usurped legitimate authority for their own selfish purposes. These intellectual developments created ideological foundations for political opposition that extended far beyond immediate economic grievances to question the fundamental legitimacy of the Tokugawa system itself. The emphasis on imperial restoration as a solution to contemporary problems provided alternative visions of political organization that could appeal to various groups who had become dissatisfied with existing arrangements for different reasons. Impoverished samurai could envision restoration of their traditional status and economic security, while wealthy merchants might anticipate greater political influence commensurate with their economic importance. And even some peasant communities could hope for relief from oppressive taxation and administrative interference in their local affairs. The arrival of foreign ships in Japanese waters during the early 19th century transformed these domestic political tensions into urgent national security concerns that required immediate responses despite the regime's lack of experience in dealing with technologically advanced foreign powers. Russian expeditions to Sakhalin and the Kurils, beginning in the 1790s, had already demonstrated that Japan's geographical isolation could no longer provide automatic protection from foreign contact, while British naval activities during the Opium Wars in China revealed the devastating military capabilities that Western nations could deploy against Asian societies that attempted to resist their demands for commercial access and diplomatic recognition. The Morrison incident of 1837, in which Japanese coastal batteries fired upon an American merchant vessel that was attempting to return shipwrecked Japanese sailors, illustrated both the rigidity of Sakoku policies and their increasing impracticality in an era of expanding global maritime commerce. The ship's peaceful intentions and humanitarian mission created diplomatic embarrassments that undermined Japanese claims about the defensive nature of their isolation policies. while demonstrating that foreign vessels possessed navigational capabilities and military technologies that made them extremely difficult to exclude through traditional coastal defense methods. The incident's aftermath revealed significant disagreements within the Tokugawa government about appropriate responses to foreign contact, with some officials advocating for policy modifications that might prevent future confrontations, while others insisted on strict enforcement of existing exclusion laws regardless of their practical consequences. The Tenpo reforms implemented by Mizuno Tadakuni beginning in 1841 represented the most comprehensive attempt to address these mounting challenges through administrative reorganization and policy innovation that might restore the regime's effectiveness without abandoning fundamental principles of Tokugawa governance. The reforms included efforts to reduce government expenditures through bureaucratic streamlining, agricultural improvements designed to increase tax revenues, and sumptuary regulations intended to restore proper social distinctions that had become blurred through commercial development and cultural change. However, these measures proved largely ineffective because they addressed symptoms rather than underlying structural problems, while failing to provide adequate resources or authority for implementing meaningful changes in established practices. The reform program's agricultural components included attempts to encourage farmers to return to rice cultivation rather than pursuing cash crop production that had reduced food security while creating dangerous dependence on market fluctuations. Government officials promoted new agricultural techniques and crop varieties while providing financial incentives for land reclamation projects that might expand Japan's cultivated area without requiring fundamental changes in existing social or economic relationships. These efforts achieved limited success in some regions, but failed to address the basic problem that commercial agriculture had become more profitable than subsistence farming for many rural communities, making voluntary compliance with government preferences economically irrational for individual farmers. The urban reforms included attempts to control population growth in major cities through restrictions on migration from rural areas, regulations governing commercial activities that might compete with traditional craft guilds, and sumptuary laws designed to prevent merchant families from displaying wealth in ways that challenged samurai social superiority. The dissolution of merchant monopolies and the attempted relocation of urban populations to agricultural areas proved particularly unpopular and ultimately unsuccessful, as they conflicted with economic trends that had created substantial vested interests in existing commercial arrangements. The resistance to these measures demonstrated how thoroughly Japanese society had been transformed by 2 centuries of peace and commercial development, despite official policies designed to maintain traditional social structures. The failure of the Tenpo reforms created political opportunities for critics who argued that more fundamental changes were necessary to address Japan's mounting problems while maintaining national independence in an increasingly dangerous international environment. The emergence of the Sono Joy movement during the 1850s reflected growing recognition that domestic reform and foreign policy were inseparably connected, as Japan's internal weaknesses made the country vulnerable to foreign pressure, while external threats required internal unity and strength that the existing political system seemed incapable of providing. When Commodore Matthew Perry's squadron entered Edo Bay on July 8, 1853, the sight of 4 heavily armed steamships advancing against the wind through waters that Japanese coastal defences had been designed to protect created immediate recognition that Japan faced unprecedented challenges requiring responses that transcended traditional diplomatic and military capabilities. The black hulls of Perry's vessels, with their towering smokestacks and obvious technological superiority over anything in Japanese arsenals, provided unmistakable evidence that the outside world had developed capabilities that made Japan's isolation policies both obsolete and dangerous to maintain. Perry's initial demands for fuel, provisions and protection for shipwrecked sailors appeared relatively modest compared to the comprehensive commercial treaties that European powers had imposed on China, but Japanese officials recognized that accepting any foreign demands would establish precedents that could lead to progressively greater concessions and eventual loss of national independence. The American Commodore's presentation of President Fillmore's letter, delivered with elaborate ceremony that demonstrated both respect for Japanese sovereignty and implicit threats about consequences of non-compliance, created diplomatic dilemmas that the Tokugawa government was institutionally unprepared to address through existing decision-making procedures. The year-long deliberation period that Perry allowed before returning for a definitive response provided opportunities for extensive consultation between the shogunate and various daimyo, whose cooperation would be essential for implementing any agreement with foreign powers. This consultation process, unprecedented in Tokugawa administrative history, revealed profound disagreements about appropriate responses to foreign pressure while exposing the regime's inability to achieve consensus among key stakeholders about fundamental policy directions. Some domains advocated for immediate military resistance regardless of the probable outcome, while others supported negotiated accommodation that might preserve some degree of autonomy while avoiding destructive warfare against technologically superior opponents. The Treaty of Kanagawa, signed on March 31, 1854, represented a carefully crafted compromise that addressed American demands while attempting to minimize departures from traditional Japanese policies regarding foreign contact and commercial relationships. The agreement opened 2 ports to American vessels seeking supplies and assistance, while establishing consular representation that could handle future diplomatic issues without requiring direct negotiations between governments. However, the treaty's provisions for most favoured nation treatment ensured that any additional concessions granted to other foreign powers would automatically extend to the United States, creating mechanisms for progressive erosion of Japanese control over their own commercial and diplomatic policies. The domestic political consequences of the Kanagawa Agreement proved far more significant than its immediate practical effects, as the shogunate's decision to sign a treaty with foreign powers without imperial approval created constitutional crises that challenged fundamental assumptions about legitimate authority within the Japanese political system. The Emperor Komei's strong opposition to foreign treaties provided focal points for critics who argued that the Tokugawa regime had exceeded its legitimate authority while violating sacred obligations to preserve Japan's divine sovereignty against foreign contamination. The emergence of the Sono-joi slogan, combining reverence for imperial authority with demands for expelling foreign barbarians, created ideological frameworks that could unite diverse opposition groups around shared commitments to imperial restoration and national independence. The Harris Treaty of 1858, which established comprehensive commercial relationships between Japan and the United States, demonstrated how initial diplomatic concessions could lead to progressively greater foreign demands that fundamentally altered Japan's international status and domestic political arrangements. The treaty's provisions for extraterritoriality, which exempted foreign residents from Japanese legal jurisdiction, created autonomous foreign communities within Japanese territory, while establishing precedents that other Western nations quickly demanded for their own citizens. The fixed tariff rates that Japan accepted eliminated the country's ability to protect domestic industries through trade policy, while generating customs revenues that became important sources of government income despite their foreign origins. The political crisis that erupted over the Harris Treaty's ratification revealed the complete breakdown of consensus within the Tokugawa government, while demonstrating the regime's inability to maintain effective control over increasingly assertive daimyo, who possessed their own opinions about appropriate responses to foreign pressure. Naosuke's decision to sign the treaty without imperial approval, while simultaneously purging political opponents through the Ansei Purge, created unprecedented levels of political violence that culminated in his assassination outside Edo Castle on March 24, 1860. The successful attack by 18 Ronin from Mito Domain, carried out in broad daylight within sight of the shogunal residence, demonstrated that even the highest government officials were vulnerable to political violence when their policies violated strongly held convictions about legitimate authority and national honour. The escalating political violence that characterised the 1860s reflected the complete polarisation of Japanese political opinion around irreconcilable positions regarding foreign relations and domestic governance that made peaceful resolution of conflicts increasingly impossible. The Tenchugumi incident of 1863, in which loyalist activists attempted to establish an imperial government in Yamato province, demonstrated how imperial restoration movements could mobilize significant popular support while challenging Tokugawa authority through direct military action. The Hamaguri Gomon incident of 1864, which involved armed clashes between imperial loyalists and Tokugawa forces within the imperial capital itself, revealed that political conflicts had reached levels of intensity that threatened the basic stability of Japanese society. The Choshu Domain's bombardment of foreign vessels in the Shimonoseki Strait during 1863 illustrated both the appeal of anti-foreign activism and its practical impossibility when confronted with superior Western military technology. The retaliatory attacks by British, French, Dutch, and American naval forces systematically destroyed Choshu's coastal defences, while demonstrating that individual domains lack the military capabilities necessary for effective resistance against foreign powers. The resulting indemnity payments and territorial concessions imposed on Choshu created additional evidence that Japan's fragmented political system was inadequate for maintaining national independence in an era of aggressive Western imperialism. The gradual recognition among opposition leaders that successful resistance to foreign pressure required national unity under more effective leadership than the Tokugawa regime could provide created opportunities for political coalitions that transcended traditional domain boundaries and ideological differences. The Satsuma-Choshu Alliance of 1866, mediated by Sakamoto Ryoma, despite the two domains' long history of mutual hostility, demonstrated that practical considerations about national survival could overcome regional rivalries when the stakes were sufficiently high. This alliance provided the military foundation for the final assault on Tokugawa authority, while creating institutional frameworks that could support alternative forms of national governance based on imperial restoration rather than warrior rule. The Boshin War, that began in January 1868, represented the culmination of 15 years of political crisis that had steadily undermined Tokugawa legitimacy, while creating alternative centres of authority that could challenge the regime's claim to represent legitimate Japanese government. The Battle of Toba Fushimi, which opened the military phase of the imperial restoration movement, demonstrated that the shogunate's military forces were no longer capable of maintaining effective resistance against determined opposition that possessed both superior morale and increasingly sophisticated military organisation. The rapid collapse of Tokugawa resistance in central Japan, followed by the peaceful surrender of Edo Castle in April 1868, marked the end of nearly 7 centuries of warrior rule while creating opportunities for comprehensive political transformation under imperial auspices. The imperial forces' decisive victory at Toba Fushimi had shattered the military foundations of Tokugawa authority, but the political transformation that followed required systematic dismantling of institutional structures that had governed Japan for over 2.5 centuries. The new Meiji government, operating initially from temporary headquarters in Kyoto, before relocating to the renamed capital of Tokyo, faced the monumental challenge of replacing feudal administration with modern governmental systems capable of defending national independence, while implementing the comprehensive reforms necessary for competing with Western powers on equal terms. The Charter Oath proclaimed by Emperor Meiji on April 6, 1868, outlined ambitious principles for national transformation, including the establishment of deliberative assemblies, the pursuit of knowledge from around the world, and the abandonment of evil customs of the past. But translating these ideals into practical policies required navigating complex political relationships between former enemies who had united only temporarily around shared opposition to Tokugawa rule. The Meiji leadership's composition reflected the coalition nature of the Restoration movement, while revealing the practical challenges of governing a diverse nation through consensus among groups that possessed fundamentally different visions of Japan's future direction. The oligarchy that emerged from the Restoration included samurai from Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and Heizan domains, who had provided military leadership during the final campaigns against the shogunate, court nobles who had maintained imperial legitimacy during centuries of warrior rule, and wealthy merchants whose financial resources had supported the Restoration movement while expecting political influence commensurate with their economic contributions. These diverse groups agreed on the necessity of eliminating Tokugawa institutions, but disagree profoundly about the specific reforms that should replace the old system, creating internal tensions that would influence policy decisions throughout the early Meiji period. The abolition of the Han system on August 29, 1871, represented the most radical transformation in Japanese political organization since the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate 7 centuries earlier. The replacement of approximately 260 semi-autonomous domains with 72 prefectures under direct central government control eliminated the feudal territorial structure that had provided the foundation for warrior rule while creating administrative uniformity that could support national policies regarding taxation, military service, and legal procedures. The implementation of this reform required extraordinary political skill from Meiji leaders who had to convince powerful daimyo to voluntarily surrender their hereditary authority in exchange for government positions and financial compensation that provided personal security while serving broader national interests. The process of Han abolition began with careful negotiations between central government representatives and individual daimyo, who controlled territories essential for national unity and defense. The leaders of Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and Hizen domains, whose military contributions had been crucial for Restoration success, agreed to surrender their Han in exchange for prominent positions within the new government structure, creating precedents that other daimyo found difficult to resist without appearing disloyal to imperial authority. The government's promise to assume responsibility for Han debts, which totaled an estimated 40 million REAO across all domains, provided crucial financial incentives for daimyo cooperation, while demonstrating the new regime's commitment to honouring existing obligations despite their feudal origins. The administrative machinery required for implementing prefectural government involved recruiting and training thousands of officials who could manage local affairs according to centralised policies rather than traditional domain customs that had varied significantly across different regions. The new prefectural governors, appointed directly by the central government rather than inheriting their positions through feudal succession, possessed educational backgrounds in Western administrative methods and legal procedures that enabled them to implement modern governmental practices while maintaining effective communication with Tokyo headquarters. The establishment of standardized administrative procedures, including uniform taxation systems, legal codes, and record-keeping methods, created bureaucratic capabilities that could coordinate national policies across vast territories while providing the detailed information necessary for informed decision-making about resource allocation and development priorities. The transformation of the samurai class presented even greater challenges than administrative reorganization, because it required fundamental changes in the identity and economic foundation of approximately 400,000 warrior families who had defined themselves through military service and social privilege for generations. The government's initial approach attempted to preserve samurai status while redirecting their activities towards civilian occupations that could contribute to national modernization and economic development. The establishment of the Kazoku and Shizoku classes created new hierarchical categories that maintained formal recognition of former samurai status, while encouraging adaptation to contemporary economic realities through education, business investment, and professional careers that utilized their administrative experience and educational advantages. The abolition of samurai stipends, implemented gradually between 1873 and 1876, eliminated the hereditary income that had supported warrior families since the establishment of the Tokugawa system, while forcing former samurai to seek alternative sources of livelihood in an increasingly competitive economic environment. The government's commutation of rice, stipends, into government bonds provided some financial security for the transition period, but the bonds' declining value and the absence of guaranteed employment opportunities created severe hardships for many samurai families who lack the capital or skills necessary for successful adaptation to commercial or professional careers. The most severely affected families faced genuine destitution as their traditional sources of income disappeared, while new economic opportunities remained limited to those who possessed either substantial capital for business investment or specialized knowledge that could command premium wages in emerging industries. The prohibition of sword wearing, formally implemented through the Haitarai Edict of March 28, 1876, represented the most symbolically significant assault on samurai identity through its elimination of the visible markers that had distinguished the warrior class from other social groups for centuries. The katana and wakizashi that samurai had worn as symbols of their status and instruments of their profession became illegal accessories that marked their bearers as criminals subject to arrest and punishment by police forces that increasingly included former commoners armed with modern weapons and legal authority. The psychological impact of this prohibition extended far beyond its practical effects, as many samurai experienced the loss of their swords as a fundamental attack on their masculine identity and social worth that reduced them to the level of ordinary citizens without special privileges or recognition. The resistance to these reforms culminated in a series of samurai rebellions that tested the new government's military capabilities while demonstrating the depth of opposition to the elimination of traditional warrior privileges. The Saga Rebellion of 1874, led by Eto Shinpei, who had previously served in the Meiji government, before becoming disillusioned with its policies, involved approximately 2,500 former samurai who attempted to restore traditional domain autonomy while protesting the abolition of their hereditary rights and privileges. The rebellion's rapid suppression by government forces, equipped with modern rifles and artillery, demonstrated both the obsolescence of traditional samurai military methods and the new regime's determination to eliminate armed resistance to its modernization policies, regardless of the social status or previous service records of the rebels. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, who had been one of the most prominent leaders of the Meiji Restoration, represented the largest and most serious challenge to the new government's authority while symbolizing the fundamental incompatibility between traditional samurai values and modern state requirements. Saigo's army of approximately 40,000 former samurai from Kyushu domains employed traditional weapons and tactics against government forces that included peasant conscripts armed with modern rifles and supported by artillery units trained according to Western military principles. The siege of Kumamoto Castle, which lasted for 53 days during the spring of 1877, demonstrated both the tactical skill and ultimate futility of samurai resistance against opponents who possessed superior numbers, equipment, and logistical support. The rebellion's conclusion at the Battle of Shiroyama on September 24th, 1877, marked the final defeat of organized samurai resistance to Meiji modernization, while providing a dramatic illustration of the transformation that Japanese society had undergone during the previous decade. Saigo's final charge with approximately 400 surviving followers against government positions defended by thousands of conscript soldiers equipped with modern weapons, represented a deliberate choice of death over surrender that reflected traditional warrior values while acknowledging the impossibility of victory against the forces of modernization. The battle's outcome, with the complete destruction of the rebel force and Saigo's ritual suicide, eliminated the last significant military threat to the Meiji government while creating a martyred hero whose memory would influence Japanese nationalism for generations. The establishment of universal military conscription through the Military Service Law of January 10, 1873, fundamentally altered the relationship between military service and social status, while creating national armed forces that could defend Japan against foreign threats without relying on traditional warrior classes whose loyalty to the new regime remained questionable. The requirement that all male citizens serve 3 years of active duty followed by 4 years in the reserves eliminated the samurai monopoly on military service while creating opportunities for social advancement through military careers that were open to individuals regardless of their family background or hereditary status. The new conscript army, trained according to Western military methods and equipped with modern weapons purchased from European manufacturers, possessed capabilities that far exceeded those of traditional samurai forces, while representing national rather than regional or class interests. The cultural transformation that accompanied these institutional changes involved systematic efforts to preserve valuable elements of traditional Japanese civilization, while eliminating practices that hindered modernization or conflicted with international standards of civilized behavior. The government's promotion of Bushido as a national ethical system attempted to extract moral principles from samurai culture while divorcing them from the feudal social relationships and violent practices that had characterized warrior society during the Edo period. This idealized version of warrior values emphasized loyalty, courage, and self-sacrifice as universal virtues that could inspire all Japanese citizens rather than exclusive privileges of a hereditary military class, creating cultural foundations for modern nationalism that drew upon historical traditions while adapting them to contemporary requirements. The preservation of traditional arts and crafts received government support through policies that recognized their cultural value while encouraging adaptation to modern economic conditions and international markets. The establishment of art schools and cultural institutions provided training opportunities for traditional craftsmen, while creating new markets for their products among both domestic consumers who appreciated historical continuity and foreign buyers who valued Japanese artistic achievements. The transformation of sword-making from a military necessity into an artistic pursuit exemplified this cultural adaptation, as master swordsmiths continued practicing their craft while producing ceremonial weapons and artistic objects that preserved traditional techniques while serving contemporary aesthetic rather than military purposes. The integration of Western knowledge and technology proceeded through systematic study missions and educational exchanges that enabled Japanese scholars and officials to acquire practical expertise while maintaining critical perspective on foreign institutions and practices. The Iwakura mission, which departed Japan in December 1871 for an 18-month tour of the United States and Europe, provided first-hand observation of Western governmental systems, industrial technologies and educational methods, while enabling Japanese leaders to negotiate treaty revisions and establish diplomatic relationships based on mutual respect rather than the unequal agreements imposed during the 1850s. The mission's detailed reports on Western achievements and failures provided essential information for policy decisions about which foreign innovations should be adopted and which aspects of Japanese tradition should be preserved or modified. The economic foundations for these transformations required fundamental changes in land tenure, taxation, and commercial regulation that could generate the revenues necessary for supporting modern government operations while encouraging productive investment and technological innovation. The land tax reform of 1873 replaced the traditional rice tax with monetary payments based on assessed land values, creating predictable government revenues while enabling farmers to make independent decisions about crop selection and agricultural methods based on market conditions rather than tax requirements. The establishment of modern banking systems, stock exchanges, and commercial law provided institutional frameworks for capital formation and business development, while protecting property rights and contractual relationships according to international standards. The social implications of these economic changes extended far beyond immediate financial considerations to influence family relationships, community structures, and individual opportunities in ways that fundamentally altered Japanese society while preserving essential cultural continuities. The elimination of hereditary occupational restrictions enabled individuals to pursue careers based on personal ability and interest rather than family tradition, creating unprecedented social mobility while generating anxiety among groups whose status had depended on traditional hierarchical arrangements. The emergence of new professional and commercial elites drawn from diverse social backgrounds created alternative sources of leadership and influence, while challenging established patterns of deference and authority that had characterized feudal society. The educational system that emerged during this period reflected both practical requirements for training citizens capable of participating effectively in modern society and cultural commitments to preserving Japanese identity while acquiring universal knowledge and skills. The education system, Order of 1872, established compulsory elementary education for all children regardless of social background, while creating institutional frameworks for secondary and higher education that could produce the technical specialists and administrative personnel required for national modernization. The curriculum combined basic literacy and numerical skills with moral instruction based on traditional Japanese values, creating educational experiences that prepared students for contemporary challenges while maintaining cultural continuity with historical traditions. The international recognition that Japan achieved through these comprehensive reforms demonstrated that non-Western societies could successfully adapt to modern requirements while preserving their cultural identity and political independence. The revision of unequal treaties that had been imposed during the 1850s required decades of patient negotiation and demonstration of Japan's commitment to international legal standards, but the eventual achievement of tariff autonomy and elimination of extraterritoriality marked Japan's acceptance as an equal member of the international community. This diplomatic success provided validation for the Meiji modernization strategy, while establishing precedents that would influence other Asian societies seeking to maintain independence, while adapting to Western-dominated international systems. The completion of Japan's feudal transformation by 1871 marked the end of a political and social system that had governed the archipelago for nearly 7 centuries, while creating foundations for the modern nation-state that would emerge as a major world power within a single generation. The systematic dismantling of feudal institutions, the transformation of traditional social classes, and the preservation of valuable cultural elements within modern frameworks demonstrated both the possibility of successful modernization without complete cultural surrender and the enormous costs that such transformation required from individuals and communities whose lives were fundamentally altered by forces beyond their control. The Meiji Restoration's achievement in creating effective modern government while maintaining Japanese independence provided a model for other societies facing similar challenges, while the human costs of this transformation served as reminders that historical progress often requires sacrifice from those who experience its immediate effects. The legacy of Japanese feudalism lived on not in its institutional forms, which had been systematically eliminated, but in the cultural values, aesthetic traditions, and social relationships that continued to influence Japanese civilization long after the formal abolition of warrior rule and the establishment of modern governmental systems based on constitutional monarchy and bureaucratic administration.